Chapter 1. The House That Sin Built, 1877–1922. There are places on this earth where evil takes root like a cancer, spreading through stone and timber until the very foundations reek of corruption. Hinterkaifeck was such a place, a farmstead built not on honest labour and family love, but on adultery, betrayal, and the kind of shameful secrets that poison everything they touch. From the moment the first stone was laid, the house seemed to hunger for darkness, as if it knew that ordinary human decency would never be enough to satisfy its appetite. The land itself told the story to those who knew how to read it. Situated behind the hamlet of Kaifeck in the Bavarian countryside, 70 kilometres north of Munich, the farmstead squatted like a guilty secret among the dense woods that surrounded it. Hinterkaifeck, behind Kaifeck, the name itself suggested concealment, something that needed to be hidden from prying eyes and moral judgment. The forest pressed close on all sides, creating a natural barrier that muffled sounds and hid activities that should never see daylight. The house came to Cecilia Santa through divorce in 1877, a scandal that marked her as a woman of questionable virtue in the rigid moral landscape of rural Bavaria. Her first marriage to Josef Assam had crumbled in spectacular fashion, dissolving in a torrent of accusations, bitter recriminations and whispered rumours that followed her like a shadow. The divorce settlement that granted her Hinterkaifeck was less a generous gesture than an attempt by her former husband to rid himself of a woman whose very presence had become a source of shame. But shame, like a hereditary disease, rarely limits itself to a single generation. Cecilia brought her 3 children from her failed marriage to the isolated farmstead, Martin, Cecilia, and Andreas, and it was there, surrounded by whispering woods and judging silence, that she began building the foundation of a dynasty that would be cursed from its very conception. In 1886, when Cecilia was 37 years old, and her reputation already tarnished beyond repair, she married Andreas Gruber, a man 9 years her junior whose own family had questioned his choice of bride. Andreas was strong-backed and weak-willed, possessed of the kind of brooding intensity that could be mistaken for depth, but was actually nothing more than selfishness wrapped in rural stoicism. He moved into Hinterkaifeck not as a husband claiming his rightful place, but as a usurper taking possession of something that would never truly belong to him. The marriage produced 2 more children, Victoria in 1887 and Sophie in 1889, but it also produced something far more sinister. Andreas Gruber possessed the kind of appetite that conventional marriage could never satisfy, a hunger that grew stronger with each passing year of isolation in the forest-bound farmstead. The woods that surrounded Hinterkaifeck seemed to whisper to him of possibilities that civilized society would never permit, of desires that could only be satisfied in places where no one could see, no one could judge, and no one could interfere. As the children grew, the house itself seemed to expand to accommodate the growing corruption within its walls. New rooms were added not for practical purposes, but to create the kind of privacy that shameful activities required. Hallways were constructed that led to nowhere, creating spaces where conversations could be held and agreements reached that the outside world must never discover. The very architecture of Hinterkaifeck began to reflect the twisted psychology of its inhabitants, becoming a physical manifestation of secrets too terrible to speak aloud. The farmstead's isolation proved to be both blessing and curse for the Gruber family. On one hand, it protected them from the constant scrutiny that rural communities typically imposed on their members, allowing them to develop their own internal rules and moral boundaries that bore no resemblance to conventional standards. On the other hand, that same isolation bred a kind of psychological incest that was perhaps even more damaging than the physical violations that would later occur. Without the moderating influence of neighbours, friends, or extended family, the Grubers created their own moral universe where normal human relationships could be twisted into whatever shape served their darkest impulses. Andreas, as the patriarch and primary landowner, established himself as the ultimate authority over every aspect of his family's existence. His word became law. His desires became imperatives, and his twisted appetites became the organizing principle around which the entire household revolved. The children who grew up in this environment learned early that their father's will was absolute, and that resistance would be met with consequences that extended far beyond simple punishment. They learned to read his moods like weather patterns, to anticipate his needs before he expressed them, and to accept that their own desires and dreams were secondary to his comfort and satisfaction. Most importantly, they learned that the outside world could never be allowed to discover what really went on behind Hinterkaifeck's walls. Victoria, born into this atmosphere of secrecy and control, never had the opportunity to develop a normal understanding of family relationships or personal boundaries. From her earliest memories, she knew that her father possessed absolute power over her life, and that her mother, despite being technically the head of the household, would never protect her from whatever he might demand. The house itself seemed to participate in her corruption, its walls absorbing her childhood fears and transforming them into something far more sinister. As Victoria entered adolescence, the corruption that had been building within Hinterkaifeck's walls finally found its ultimate expression. Andreas Gruber, no longer content with the psychological domination he had exercised over his daughter since birth, began to demand physical submission as well. What started as inappropriate touches and boundary violations gradually escalated into systematic sexual abuse that would continue for years, protected by the isolation of the farmstead and the complicity of a family structure that had been twisted beyond recognition. The woods surrounding Hinterkaifeck seemed to approve of these developments, their shadows growing deeper and more concealing with each passing season. Local residents began to notice that the Gruber family kept to themselves more than was normal even for rural Bavaria, rarely attending church services or community gatherings, and conducting their business transactions with a brusque efficiency that discouraged social interaction. When neighbours did encounter members of the Gruber family, they invariably commented on the strange atmosphere that seemed to surround them, a sense of secrets carefully guarded, of conversations cut short when outsiders approached, and of a family dynamic that felt fundamentally wrong despite being impossible to define. Andreas Gruber, in particular, developed a reputation for unpredictable mood swings and a kind of brooding intensity that made people uncomfortable in his presence. The farmstead itself began to reflect the corruption of its inhabitants in ways both subtle and obvious. The buildings, once well-maintained and prosperous-looking, took on a neglected appearance that suggested their owner's attention was focused on other matters. Windows remained unwashed for months at a time, giving the house a blind, secretive appearance that seemed to discourage visitors. The gardens, once productive and carefully tended, became overgrown and wild, as if the land itself was rejecting the kind of cultivation that required honest labour and healthy family cooperation. By the time Victoria reached adulthood, the transformation of Hinterkaifeck from a family home into something far more sinister was complete. The house had become a breeding ground for every kind of moral corruption, a place where normal human relationships had been systematically perverted and where the most fundamental taboos of civilized society were violated as a matter of routine. The marriage between Andreas and his daughter was not a sudden aberration, but the inevitable result of years of careful grooming and psychological manipulation. The house that sin built had finally achieved its ultimate purpose, creating conditions where the most forbidden desires could be satisfied without interference from the outside world. The isolation that had once been a practical necessity for farming had become a psychological prison where normal moral constraints no longer applied. As 1922 began, Hinterkaifeck stood as a monument to human corruption, its walls holding secrets that would horrify even the most jaded observers of human nature. The house had served its dark purpose well, nurturing evil like a greenhouse nurtures exotic plants, creating conditions where ordinary human decency could not survive. But evil, like any living thing, requires sustenance to thrive, and the appetites that Hinterkaifeck had cultivated were growing larger and more demanding with each passing day. The woods that surrounded the farmstead seemed to sense that something was building toward a climax, their shadows growing deeper and more menacing as winter gave way to spring. Local wildlife avoided the area with an instinct that civilization had bred out of humans, and even the domestic animals on the farm displayed signs of unease that their owners were too corrupted to recognize. The house that sin built was preparing for its final, most terrible harvest, and the evil that had taken root in its foundations was ready to bloom into something that would shock even those who thought they understood the depths of human depravity. Hinterkaifeck had served as an incubator for 45 years, carefully nurturing the kind of moral corruption that could only exist in places where normal human oversight had been systematically eliminated. But every house, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually faces forces that even the most corrupted foundations cannot withstand. The evil that had been so carefully cultivated within Hinterkaifeck's walls was about to encounter something even darker, even more twisted and even more hungry for destruction than the family that called it home. The house that Sin built was about to discover that it was not the only monster hiding in the Bavarian woods. Chapter 2: The Father's Hunger. 1907-1915. Andreas Gruber first laid hands on his daughter Victoria during the harsh winter of 1907, when she was 20 years old and still possessed of the kind of innocence that could be systematically destroyed through careful application of paternal authority. The act itself was preceded by months of psychological preparation, a gradual erosion of boundaries that transformed normal fatherly affection into something far more sinister and predatory. The corruption began with touches that lingered just slightly too long, with conversations that pushed the boundaries of appropriate father-daughter interaction, and with a growing insistence that Victoria's loyalty to her family required absolute obedience to her father's will. Andreas possessed the kind of manipulative intelligence that could twist natural human emotions into tools for exploitation, and he applied that intelligence to the systematic corruption of his own flesh and blood. Hinterkaifeck's isolation proved to be the perfect environment for this gradual seduction of innocence. With no neighbours close enough to observe daily interactions, no extended family to provide alternative perspectives on normal relationships, and no social structures to enforce conventional moral boundaries, Andreas was free to create his own rules governing his daughter's behaviour and his own access to her body. The physical violations that began in 1907 were not sudden, violent assaults, but rather a carefully orchestrated campaign of progressive boundary erosion. Andreas understood that complete submission required the destruction of his victim's ability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate behaviour, and he approached this psychological dismantling with the same methodical patience he applied to his farming operations. Victoria's initial resistance was overcome through a combination of physical intimidation, emotional manipulation, and the kind of gaslighting that made her question her own perceptions of reality. When she protested that his behaviour was wrong, Andreas convinced her that her objections were evidence of her own moral corruption rather than his. When she threatened to tell others about what was happening, he reminded her that her reputation and the family's standing in the community depended on her silence. The house itself seemed to participate in Victoria's corruption, its walls providing the privacy necessary for Andreas's assaults, while its isolation ensured that her screams would never reach ears that might provide help or intervention. The rooms that had once been her childhood sanctuary became chambers of violation, each space holding memories of specific acts that gradually broke down her resistance and transformed her into something that was neither willing participant nor innocent victim. By 1910, the incestuous relationship between Andreas and Victoria had achieved a kind of terrible normalcy within the twisted ecosystem of Hinterkaifeck. What had begun as furtive encounters conducted in secrecy had evolved into an openly acknowledged arrangement that governed the daily operations of the household. Victoria had been transformed from daughter into concubine, her role in the family fundamentally altered by her father's appetite and her own inability to escape the psychological prison he had constructed around her. The other family members' response to this corruption revealed the extent to which Hinterkaifeck had become a place where normal moral standards no longer applied. Cecilia Gruber, Victoria's mother, possessed enough awareness to understand what was occurring under her roof, but lacked either the moral courage or psychological strength to intervene. Her silence in the face of her daughter's systematic abuse made her a collaborator in the corruption, transforming her from innocent bystander into active enabler of incestuous violence. The house's capacity for concealing evil reached its full expression during this period, as the family developed elaborate routines designed to hide their activities from the outside world while accommodating the demands of Andreas's appetites. Victoria learned to time her movements to avoid encounters with neighbours, to explain away physical evidence of abuse as accidents or illnesses, and to present a facade of normalcy that would deflect suspicions about her relationship with her father. But secrets of this magnitude possess a weight that eventually becomes impossible to bear, and by 1914, the corruption within Hinterkaifeck had begun to manifest in ways that could not be entirely concealed from the outside world. Victoria's marriage to Carl Gabriel in March of that year was as much an attempt to escape her father's control as it was a conventional romantic union, though she had been too damaged by years of abuse to form healthy relationships with anyone. Carl Gabriel represented everything that Andreas Gruber was not: young, idealistic, and possessed of conventional moral standards that made him incapable of recognizing the depth of corruption he was marrying into. His love for Victoria was genuine but naive, based on his perception of her as an innocent young woman rather than the psychologically damaged victim of systematic sexual abuse that she had become. The marriage also represented a transfer of legal ownership of Hinterkaifeck from Andreas to his daughter and new son-in-law, a change that should have provided Victoria with the independence necessary to escape her father's control. Instead, it merely complicated the power dynamics within the household without fundamentally altering the corrupt relationships that had been established over the previous 7 years. Andreas's response to his daughter's marriage revealed the depth of his psychological investment in maintaining sexual access to her body. Rather than accepting the loss of his primary victim and seeking satisfaction elsewhere, he began planning for the removal of the obstacle that Carl Gabriel represented. The war that erupted across Europe in 1914 provided him with the perfect opportunity to achieve this goal without direct action on his part. Carl Gabriel's conscription into the German military in late 1914 restored Andreas's access to Victoria while providing a socially acceptable explanation for the resumption of their incestuous relationship. With her husband serving on the front lines in France, Victoria found herself once again trapped in the isolated farmstead with a father whose appetites had only grown stronger during their brief separation. The news of Carl Gabriel's death at the Battle of Arras in December 1914 was received at Hinterkaifeck with a mixture of grief and relief that perfectly captured the moral confusion that permeated every aspect of the family's existence. Victoria mourned her husband's death as both a personal loss and the destruction of her only hope for escape from her father's control, while Andreas saw it as divine providence removing an inconvenient obstacle to his continued enjoyment of his daughter's body. The birth of Victoria's daughter Cecilia in January 1915 added another layer of complexity to the already twisted family dynamics. The child's parentage was officially attributed to her deceased father, but the timing of her birth and her physical resemblance to Andreas suggested a more troubling reality. The infant represented both the fruit of incestuous union and a potential future victim for Andreas's expanding appetites. The legal proceedings that resulted from the incestuous relationship between Andreas and Victoria in 1915 provided the outside world with its first glimpse into the corruption that had taken root at Hinterkaifeck. The conviction of both parties for engaging in prohibited sexual relations should have served as a warning that the family's moral boundaries had been catastrophically compromised, but the relatively light sentences imposed by the court suggested that even legal authorities were reluctant to confront the full implications of what had occurred. Andreas's 1-year prison sentence removed him from Hinterkaifeck temporarily, but did nothing to address the psychological damage he had inflicted on his daughter or the corrupt family dynamics he had created. His time in confinement merely intensified his appetite for control and sexual gratification, ensuring that his return to the farmstead would bring with it an escalation of the abusive behaviours that had already destroyed Victoria's capacity for normal human relationships. Victoria's 1-month sentence reflected society's tendency to view women as inherently less culpable than men in cases of sexual transgression, but it also demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the power dynamics that made genuine consent impossible in relationships between fathers and daughters. Her conviction and punishment served to further isolate her from potential sources of help, while reinforcing her father's narrative that she was equally responsible for their criminal relationship. The return to Hinterkaifeck of both Andreas and Victoria following their imprisonment marked the beginning of a new and even more depraved phase in their relationship. The public exposure of their incestuous activities had destroyed any remaining pretense of normal family relationships, while failing to provide either punishment severe enough to deter future violations or intervention sufficient to protect potential victims. Andreas's psychological evolution during this period revealed the true depths of his corruption and the extent to which his appetite for domination had grown beyond simple sexual gratification. The legal consequences he had faced for his abuse of Victoria had not served as a deterrent, but rather as a challenge to be more careful, more secretive, and more complete in his control over his victims. The birth of Joseph Gruber in 1919 Another child whose parentage was officially attributed to Victoria's relationship with neighbour Lorenz Schlittenbauer, but whose physical characteristics suggested a more troubling reality, demonstrated that the incestuous relationship between father and daughter had not only continued but had become more systematic and productive. The existence of two children who might have been the products of incestuous union created a new generation of potential victims, while providing Andreas with additional leverage to ensure his daughter's continued compliance. By 1920, Hinterkaifeck had evolved into something that transcended conventional categories of family dysfunction or criminal behaviour. The farmstead had become a laboratory for the systematic exploration of taboo desires, a place where the most fundamental prohibitions of human society were not merely violated but transformed into organising principles for daily life. Andreas Gruber's hunger had grown beyond simple sexual appetite into something that resembled a philosophy of domination, a belief system that justified the complete subordination of other human beings to his desires and needs. His daughter had become not merely a victim but an accomplice in her own degradation, her psychological destruction so complete that she could no longer distinguish between love and abuse, between family loyalty and criminal complicity. The house itself had been transformed by years of systematic violation into something that was no longer quite human in its moral orientation. The walls had absorbed so much pain, so many screams, and so many acts of degradation that they seemed to emanate an aura of corruption that infected everyone who spent time within them. Visitors to Hinterkaifeck invariably reported feeling uncomfortable in ways they could not articulate, sensing something fundamentally wrong with the atmosphere, even when they could not identify specific evidence of criminal activity. As 1920 turned to 1921 and then to 1922, the corruption that had taken root at Hinterkaifeck continued to spread and deepen, creating conditions that would eventually attract the attention of something even more twisted and dangerous than the family that had nurtured it. Andreas Gruber's hunger had created a beacon of evil that called out across the Bavarian countryside to anyone whose own appetites ran toward violence and domination. The father's hunger had consumed everything it touched, transforming a family home into a nest of predators and victims whose very existence violated the most basic assumptions about human nature and social organization. But hunger, once awakened, can never be truly satisfied, and the appetites that Andreas had cultivated were about to encounter something that would make his own depravity seem almost innocent by comparison. The darkness that had been carefully nurtured within Hinterkaifeck's walls was about to attract a different kind of darkness from outside, and the collision between these two forms of evil would produce consequences that would shock even those who thought they understood the depths to which human beings could sink. Chapter 3. The Widow's Burden. 1914-1922. Victoria Gabriel learned to wear widowhood like a mask, hiding behind the socially acceptable grief of a war widow, while concealing the far more complex reality of a woman whose liberation and imprisonment had arrived in the same telegram announcing her husband's death. Carl Gabriel's demise at the Battle of Arras in December 1914 freed her from a marriage that had never provided the escape from her father's appetites that she had desperately hoped for, but it also sealed her fate as Andreas Gruber's permanent possession in ways that legal marriage never could have accomplished. The transformation from reluctant daughter to willing accomplice did not happen overnight, but rather through a gradual process of psychological erosion that began with Carl's departure for the front lines and accelerated dramatically upon news of his death. Victoria discovered that freedom from one form of male domination did not automatically result in liberation, but could instead lead to an even more complete surrender to the familiar demons she had spent her entire adult life trying to escape. The months immediately following Carl's death revealed the extent to which Victoria's capacity for normal human relationships had been systematically destroyed by years of incestuous abuse. When neighbours and community members offered their condolences and support, she found herself unable to respond with the appropriate emotions or behaviours expected of a grieving widow. Her reactions seemed either exaggerated or completely absent, as if she were performing a role she had observed but never truly understood. The birth of her daughter Cecilia in January 1915 should have provided Victoria with a focus for maternal love and a motivation to break free from the corrupt family dynamics that had shaped her entire life. Instead, the infant became another tool in Andreas's psychological manipulation, a living reminder of his continued power over his daughter's body, and a potential future victim whose safety depended entirely on Victoria's continued compliance with his demands. The legal proceedings that resulted in both Andreas and Victoria's conviction for incest in 1915 marked a crucial turning point in her psychological development. The public exposure of their relationship should have provided her with an opportunity to seek help from authorities or social services, but instead it served to further isolate her from potential sources of support, while reinforcing her father's narrative that she was equally culpable for their criminal activities. Victoria's 1-month prison sentence, while significantly shorter than her father's year-long confinement, had profound psychological effects that extended far beyond the period of actual incarceration. The experience of being publicly labelled as a criminal and sexual deviant destroyed any remaining sense of moral authority she might have possessed, making it impossible for her to view herself as a victim deserving of protection, rather than a willing participant who had earned her fate through her own choices. The return to Hinterkaifeck following her release from prison marked the beginning of Victoria's final transformation from victim to accomplice. The isolation of the farmstead, combined with her complete lack of alternatives and the psychological damage inflicted by years of abuse, made resistance seem not merely futile but actually unthinkable. She began to adapt to her circumstances with the kind of practical acceptance that victims often develop when escape becomes impossible. The relationship between Victoria and her father during this period evolved into something that defied conventional categories of coercion or consent. While Andreas maintained his position of absolute authority within the household, Victoria developed her own forms of agency within the constraints he imposed, learning to anticipate his needs and desires in ways that provided her with a sense of control over her own degradation. This psychological adaptation allowed Victoria to survive circumstances that might have driven other victims to suicide or complete mental collapse, but it also required her to participate actively in her own corruption. She learned to present herself to her father in ways that satisfied his appetites, while maintaining the facade of normal family relationships when outsiders were present. Most importantly, she learned to view her own children as extensions of the corrupt family system, rather than as innocents deserving protection from its influence. The birth of Josef Gruber in 1919 represented the culmination of Victoria's transformation from victim to enabler. While the child's official father was listed as Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Victoria's lover and a neighbour who had agreed to accept paternal responsibility, the timing of the birth and the child's physical characteristics suggested that Andreas had once again impregnated his own daughter. Rather than viewing this development as evidence of continued abuse requiring intervention, Victoria embraced it as confirmation of her special relationship with her father and her unique position within the family hierarchy. The existence of 2 children who might have been the products of incestuous union provided her with a sense of importance and purpose that she had never experienced in legitimate relationships with men her own age. Victoria's relationship with Lorenz Schlittenbauer during this period revealed the extent to which her capacity for normal romantic attachment had been compromised by years of systematic abuse. While Schlittenbauer appeared to offer her a conventional path toward respectability and social acceptance, she found herself unable to respond to his affections with anything resembling genuine emotion or authentic desire. Instead, she used Schlittenbauer as a convenience, exploiting his genuine feelings for her to provide cover for her continued relationship with her father, while ensuring that her children would have access to the legal and social protections that came with acknowledged paternity. Her manipulation of Schlittenbauer's emotions demonstrated that she had learned her father's techniques all too well, applying them to her own relationships with a calculating efficiency that would have made Andreas proud. The domestic arrangements at Hinterkaifeck during this period reflected the complete breakdown of normal family structures and the emergence of something far more sinister in their place. Victoria functioned simultaneously as daughter, sexual partner, mother, and household manager, her various roles shifting according to Andreas's needs and desires, rather than any consistent principle of human dignity or moral responsibility. The children who grew up in this environment learned early that their mother's attention and affection were contingent on their compliance with grandfather Andreas's wishes and their acceptance of family secrets that could never be shared with outsiders. Young Cecilia, in particular, began showing signs of psychological disturbance that suggested she was already being groomed for eventual inclusion in the family's corrupt sexual dynamics. Victoria's response to her daughter's obvious distress revealed the extent to which her own moral compass had been destroyed by years of systematic abuse. Rather than protecting Cecilia from the same fate she had suffered, Victoria began preparing her daughter for eventual victimization, teaching her the same lessons of absolute obedience and family loyalty that had facilitated her own destruction. The hiring and rapid departure of domestic servants during this period provided Victoria with numerous opportunities to seek help from outsiders who witnessed the family's obviously dysfunctional dynamics. Instead, she consistently chose to maintain the conspiracy of silence that protected Andreas's activities, actively participating in the intimidation and dismissal of servants who asked too many questions or expressed concern about the children's welfare. Crescens Riga, the previous maid who quit in late 1921 after reporting strange sounds from the attic and an overall atmosphere of evil within the household, represented Victoria's last realistic opportunity to seek outside intervention. Riga's obvious terror and desperate flight from Hinterkaifeck should have prompted Victoria to question whether her family's secrets were worth protecting at the cost of everyone's safety. Instead, Victoria chose to interpret Riga's departure as evidence of the maid's weakness rather than as a reasonable response to genuinely threatening circumstances. Her dismissive attitude toward Riga's concerns demonstrated that she had become so completely identified with her father's perspective that she could no longer recognize warning signs that would have been obvious to any normally functioning adult. The arrival of Maria Baumgartner as the new maid in March 1922 represented both an opportunity and a threat to the carefully maintained equilibrium of Hinterkaifeck's corrupt household. Maria's innocence and moral clarity posed a potential challenge to the family's conspiracy of silence, but Victoria approached this challenge with the calculating intelligence she had learned from her father. Rather than viewing Maria as a potential ally who might help her escape from her circumstances, Victoria saw her as another person who needed to be managed, controlled, and ultimately sacrificed to maintain the stability of the family system that had become her entire world. Her willingness to expose an innocent woman to the dangers of Hinterkaifeck demonstrated that her transformation from victim to accomplice was finally complete. By March 1922, Victoria Gabriel had evolved into something that transcended conventional categories of victimhood or complicity. She had become a willing participant in her own degradation and an active facilitator of her children's corruption, her psychological destruction so complete that she could no longer distinguish between love and abuse, between family loyalty and criminal conspiracy. The woman who had once dreamed of escape through marriage had instead become the cornerstone of a system of exploitation that required her active participation to maintain its stability. Her children looked to her for protection she could not provide. Her lovers trusted her with emotions she could not reciprocate. And her father relied on her complicity to continue activities that violated every principle of human decency. The burden of widowhood that Victoria carried was not the conventional grief of a woman who had lost her husband to war, but rather the far more complex weight of a person who had become essential to the maintenance of evil. She had learned to find meaning and purpose in her own victimization, transforming suffering into a form of power and degradation into a source of identity. As the winter of 1922 gave way to spring, Victoria Gabriel stood at the center of a web of corruption that stretched from her father's insatiable appetites to her children's inevitable victimization to the innocent servants who unknowingly entered their sphere of influence. She had become both the guardian and the victim of secrets so terrible that their exposure would destroy not just her family, but her entire sense of self. The widow's burden she carried was the knowledge that she was no longer capable of choosing good over evil, protection over exploitation, or love over domination. She had become something that her younger self would not have recognized, a creature shaped by circumstances so extreme that normal moral categories no longer applied to her choices or actions. But burdens, no matter how carefully balanced, eventually become too heavy to bear, and the system of exploitation that Victoria had helped to maintain was about to encounter forces that would test its stability in ways that even her father's manipulative intelligence could not have anticipated. The widow's burden was about to become the catalyst for consequences that would transform Hinterkaifeck from a private hell into a public horror that would shock the entire world. Chapter 4. The Watchers in the Walls, February-March, 1922, Something evil had taken residence at Hinterkaifeck, and it was not content to remain hidden in the shadows. Whether it was supernatural malevolence drawn to the corruption that festered within the farmstead's walls, or something far more tangible and human lurking in the dense Bavarian woods, the presence made itself known through a campaign of psychological terror that would have driven normal families to seek help or flee entirely. But the Grubers were not a normal family, and their response to being hunted revealed the extent to which their capacity for recognizing genuine danger had been destroyed by years of participating in their own moral corruption. The manifestations began in February 1922, subtle at first but growing bolder and more intrusive with each passing week. Riga, the maid who had served the family since November 1920, was the first to sense that something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of the isolated farmstead. A woman of simple faith and practical intelligence, Riga possessed the kind of moral clarity that made her sensitive to evil in ways that the corrupted Gruber family could no longer perceive. The sounds that began emanating from the attic during the long winter nights defied rational explanation and challenged even Riga's religious faith. These were not the ordinary settling noises of an old building responding to temperature changes, nor were they the scurrying of rodents or other wildlife seeking shelter from the cold. Instead, they seemed deliberately produced to disturb and unsettle, as if something was testing the household's capacity for fear while measuring their responses to escalating psychological pressure. The footsteps that creaked across the attic floorboards followed no pattern that human movement would produce. They would begin suddenly in the dead of night, pacing back and forth with mechanical regularity, before stopping abruptly without any sound of departure or concealment. Sometimes they would continue for hours, wearing grooves in the silence that seemed to penetrate the dreams of everyone sleeping below. Other times they would last only minutes, but with such intensity that they seemed to shake the entire structure of the house. Riga's attempts to investigate these disturbances revealed both her courage and the futility of conventional responses to whatever was manifesting itself at Hinterkaifeck. Her searches of the attic space during daylight hours revealed no evidence of human presence, no footprints in the dust, no displaced objects, no signs that anyone had been moving around in the confined space above the main living areas. Yet the sounds continued night after night, growing more confident and intrusive, as if encouraged by the family's inability to identify their source. The psychological impact of these nocturnal disturbances on the household was profound and revealing. While Riga responded with increasing terror and a growing determination to flee the premises, the Gruber family members displayed a disturbing acceptance of the supernatural harassment that suggested they viewed it as somehow deserved or inevitable. Andreas, in particular, seemed almost pleased by the manifestations, as if their presence confirmed his belief that he and his family existed outside the boundaries of normal, moral and physical laws. Victoria's response to the haunting revealed the extent to which her psychological development had been warped by years of systematic abuse. Rather than viewing the supernatural activity as a threat to her children's safety and well-being, she interpreted it as validation of her family's special status and evidence that they were connected to forces that ordinary people could never understand or access. Her willingness to expose her young children to clearly malevolent supernatural influences demonstrated that her capacity for protective maternal instinction had been completely destroyed. The children themselves responded to the manifestations with the kind of adaptive resignation that victims of chronic abuse develop when normal adult protection is unavailable. 7-year-old Cecilia learned to sleep through disturbances that would have terrified most adults, while 2-year-old Joseph seemed to accept the presence of unseen watchers as a normal part of his environment. Their acceptance of supernatural terror as routine revealed the extent to which their moral and psychological development had already been corrupted by their exposure to their grandfather's influence. But the presence that haunted Hinterkaifeck was not content to limit itself to auditory manifestations. As February gave way to March, the supernatural activity began to include physical interactions with the environment that suggested whatever was watching. The family was growing more confident and more invasive in its approach to psychological warfare. Objects began disappearing and reappearing in locations where they had no logical reason to be found. Kitchen utensils would vanish from their proper places only to turn up days later in the barn or the cellar, arranged in patterns that seemed deliberately designed to unsettle anyone who discovered them. Personal belongings would migrate from one room to another without any family member acknowledging responsibility for moving them, creating an atmosphere of constant uncertainty about the most basic aspects of daily life. The missing house key that disappeared in March represented an escalation in the psychological campaign being waged against the family. Keys are symbols of security and control, and the theft of their primary means of securing their home from intrusion sent a clear message that the presence watching them had access to their most private spaces and could come and go as it pleased. The family's response to this obvious threat revealed their complete inability to distinguish between supernatural harassment and very real danger. Andreas Gruber's discovery of the mysterious newspaper from Munich that appeared on the property without explanation should have triggered alarm bells for any normally functioning adult. No one in the household had purchased the paper, no neighbour had borrowed or lost it, and the postman denied any knowledge of how it had arrived at Hinterkaifeck. The newspaper represented clear evidence that someone or something was deliberately placing objects on their property, yet Andreas chose to interpret this as merely another manifestation of the supernatural activity rather than potential evidence of human surveillance. The broken lock on the machine room door that Andreas discovered just days before the murders provided the clearest possible warning that the family was being stalked by someone with very specific knowledge of their property and routines. The machine room contained valuable equipment and tools that would be attractive targets for theft, but nothing was missing despite the obvious evidence of forced entry. This suggested that whoever had broken the lock was more interested in sending a message than in actual theft. The footprints in the fresh snow that led from the forest to the broken door but showed no corresponding tracks leading away represented the kind of physical evidence that should have prompted immediate contact with local authorities. These were not supernatural manifestations, but clear proof that someone had approached their property with deliberate intent to breach their security. Yet Andreas chose to treat this evidence as just another mysterious occurrence, rather than as proof that his family was being hunted by a very real and very dangerous predator. Riga's growing terror during this period reflected the natural response of a psychologically healthy person to genuine supernatural harassment, combined with increasingly obvious signs of human stalking. Her decision to quit her position and flee Hinterkaifeck in late February represented the last opportunity for the family to receive outside validation that their circumstances had become genuinely dangerous and required immediate intervention from authorities. Instead of listening to Riga's warnings or taking her terror seriously, the family chose to interpret her departure as evidence of her weakness and unsuitability for service in their household. They had become so accustomed to their own corruption that they could no longer recognize appropriate responses to genuine threats, viewing normal self-preservation instincts as character flaws rather than reasonable reactions to dangerous circumstances. The hiring of Maria Baumgartner to replace Riga represented a tragic repetition of the pattern that had destroyed every previous attempt at outside intervention in the family's circumstances. Ria's innocence and moral clarity made her sensitive to the same supernatural and human threats that had driven Riga away, but her economic desperation and lack of alternatives made her willing to ignore warning signs that should have sent her fleeing back to the safety of town. The presence that watched Hinterkaifeck during these final weeks seemed to take particular pleasure in the arrival of a new victim, intensifying its campaign of psychological terror, as if anticipating the climactic violence that would soon transform the farmstead from a private hell into a public horror. The supernatural manifestations became more frequent and more aggressive, while the signs of human surveillance grew more obvious and more threatening. The family's response to this escalation revealed the complete breakdown of their survival instincts and their inability to distinguish between familiar forms of corruption and genuinely existential threats. They had become so accustomed to living with evil that they could no longer recognize when that evil was about to consume them entirely. Andreas Gruber's refusal to seek help from neighbors or authorities, despite mounting evidence that his family was being stalked, demonstrated the extent to which his psychological investment in maintaining secrecy had become more important to him than protecting his own life, or the lives of his loved ones. He had spent so many years hiding his family's shameful activities that he was incapable of reaching out for help, even when their survival depended on it. The watchers in the walls had achieved their purpose, creating an atmosphere of terror and helplessness that would make their final assault easier to accomplish. Whether supernatural or human, they had successfully isolated their intended victims from potential sources of help, while conditioning them to accept escalating threats as just another manifestation of the evil they had invited into their lives through their own moral corruption. As March 1922 drew to a close, the presence that haunted Hinterkaifeck prepared for the culmination of its campaign of psychological warfare. The family that had spent decades corrupting themselves through incest, abuse, and moral degradation was about to discover that there were forms of evil in the world that made their own depravity seem almost innocent by comparison. The Watchers had finished their surveillance, completed their psychological preparation, and identified the perfect moment to transform observation into action. The walls of Hinterkaifeck had absorbed so much corruption over the years that they could no longer distinguish between the evil that had been nurtured within them and the evil that was approaching from outside. The stage was set for a confrontation between different forms of darkness, and the family that had spent so long dancing with devils was about to discover that some demons demanded more than psychological submission. They demanded blood. Chapter 5. Harbingers of Doom. March 1922. March arrived at Hinterkaifeck like a fever breaking. The last winter snows melting away to reveal a landscape that seemed somehow different, more menacing, as if the very earth had absorbed the malevolence that radiated from the farmstead and was now reflecting it back in twisted and unnatural ways. The signs of approaching doom multiplied daily during those final weeks, each manifestation more obvious and more threatening than the last, yet the corrupted family remained blind to warnings that would have sent any normal household fleeing into the night. The mysterious newspaper that appeared on Andreas Gruber's property in early March carried more than just news from Munich. It carried the scent of predatory intelligence, of someone who knew intimate details about the family's routines and vulnerabilities. The publication was not one that any member of the household had ever purchased or read, nor was it available through normal distribution channels in their remote corner of Bavaria. Its very presence suggested surveillance so detailed and prolonged that the Watcher knew not just when the family would discover it, but how they would react to finding something that should not exist in their carefully controlled environment. Andreas's initial assumption that the postman had simply delivered the wrong newspaper revealed the extent to which his capacity for recognizing genuine threats had been compromised by years of focusing on concealing his own shameful activities. A man who had spent decades hiding incestuous relationships and systematic child abuse should have possessed finely tuned instincts for detecting when he was being watched, yet he dismissed clear evidence of surveillance as a simple bureaucratic error. The newspaper itself seemed to mock the family's isolation and ignorance, its headlines describing a world of violence and political upheaval that existed just beyond their forest-bound sanctuary. Stories of murders, betrayals, and social collapse filled its pages, as if whoever had placed it there wanted the Grubers to understand that their private hell was about to be connected to larger patterns of destruction that were consuming post-war Germany. But it was the footprints in the snow that provided the clearest possible warning of impending disaster, tracks that told a story of deliberate surveillance and reconnaissance that should have terrified anyone capable of rational thought. These were not the casual impressions left by lost travellers or curious neighbours, but the systematic markings of someone who had spent considerable time studying the property's layout, identifying points of access, and planning for activities that required intimate knowledge of the family's daily routines. The tracks led from the dense forest that surrounded Hinterkaifeck directly to the machine room door, following a path that avoided the main approaches to the house while maintaining visual contact with the building's primary living areas. Whoever had made them possessed detailed knowledge of the property's blind spots and the family's patterns of movement, suggesting surveillance that had been conducted over weeks or even months. Most ominously, the footprints showed no corresponding tracks leading away from the property, as if their maker had simply vanished after completing their reconnaissance mission. This detail should have provided unmistakable evidence that the family was being stalked by someone with abilities or knowledge that transcended normal human limitations. Yet Andreas chose to interpret this supernatural aspect as evidence that the threat was not real, rather than as proof that it was far more dangerous than conventional criminal activity. The broken lock on the machine room door represented an escalation from observation to direct action, a clear message that whoever was watching the family had grown tired of passive surveillance and was now prepared to begin the active phase of whatever plan they had been developing. The machine room contained valuable farming equipment and tools that would have been attractive targets for ordinary thieves, yet nothing was missing despite the obvious evidence of forced entry. This selective restraint suggested that the intruder was not motivated by conventional criminal desires, but by something far more complex and disturbing. The violation of the family's security seemed designed to send a psychological message rather than to achieve material gain, a demonstration of power that showed the watchers could enter the property at will, and that the family's attempts at self-protection were utterly futile. Andreas's discovery of the broken lock during his routine morning inspection of the property should have prompted immediate contact with local authorities and the implementation of security measures designed to protect his family from further intrusion. Instead, he chose to repair the damage himself and increase his own vigilance, as if his individual efforts could provide protection against threats that had already demonstrated their ability to circumvent conventional security measures. This decision to handle the situation independently, rather than seeking outside help, reflected Andreas's pathological need to maintain secrecy about his family's activities, even when that secrecy placed their lives in obvious danger. He had become so invested in hiding his incestuous relationships and systematic abuse that he was willing to risk everyone's safety rather than expose their shameful secrets to the scrutiny that official intervention would inevitably bring. The sounds from the attic that had been tormenting the household since February intensified during March, becoming more frequent, more aggressive, and more obviously connected to human rather than supernatural activity. The footsteps that paced back and forth above the main living areas now followed patterns that suggested someone was systematically mapping the interior layout of the house, identifying the locations of bedrooms, understanding traffic flows, and planning for activities that would require intimate knowledge of the building's structure. The family's response to these escalating manifestations revealed the complete breakdown of their survival instincts and their inability to distinguish between familiar forms of corruption and genuinely existential threats. Rather than recognizing the sounds as evidence of human intrusion requiring immediate defensive action, they continued to interpret them as supernatural phenomena that could be endured rather than eliminated. Young Cecilia's increasing distress during this period provided another warning sign that the adults in her life were too corrupted to recognize or address appropriately. The 7-year-old began experiencing nightmares that woke her screaming in the middle of the night, dreams that she described as featuring dark figures moving through the house and threatening her family with unspeakable violence. Rather than viewing her daughter's terror as a reasonable response to genuinely threatening circumstances, Victoria chose to dismiss the nightmares as childhood imagination gone wild, perhaps triggered by the stories and rumours that circulated through rural communities during the unsettled post-war period. This maternal failure to protect represented the final stage in Victoria's transformation from victim to accomplice, her willingness to sacrifice her own child's safety to maintain the corrupt family system that had become her entire world. The disappearance of household objects during March created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty and violation that should have convinced even the most naive observer that the family was being systematically tormented by someone with regular access to their private spaces. Kitchen utensils, personal belongings, and important documents would vanish for days before reappearing in locations where they had no logical reason to be found. The pattern of these disappearances suggested intimate knowledge of the family's routines and a deliberate intent to create psychological distress through the violation of their most basic assumptions about security and privacy. Whoever was taking their belongings knew exactly which items would be missed most quickly and which locations would create the maximum psychological impact when the objects were eventually discovered. The family's response to these obvious violations revealed their complete inability to recognize the systematic nature of the campaign being waged against them. Rather than understanding that someone was deliberately tormenting them through the manipulation of their environment, they attributed each incident to forgetfulness, coincidence, or supernatural activity that could be endured rather than eliminated. As March progressed toward its climactic conclusion, the harbingers of doom multiplied and intensified, creating an atmosphere of impending catastrophe that should have sent any rational family fleeing for their lives. Strange lights were observed moving through the forest at night, following paths that seemed to converge on Hinterkaifeck from multiple directions. Unusual animal behaviour suggested that even the local wildlife sensed the approach of something that violated the natural order. The domestic animals on the farm began displaying signs of extreme agitation, refusing to enter certain areas of the property, and showing fearful responses to locations and times that had previously been routine parts of their daily existence. The family's dog, normally protective of the household, began cowering whenever he was brought near the house after dark, whimpering and attempting to flee in a manner that suggested he could sense threats that his human companions were too corrupted to perceive. But perhaps the most ominous harbinger of all was the arrival of Maria Baumgartner on March 31st, walking unknowingly into a situation that had been carefully orchestrated to provide the perfect victim for whatever climactic violence had been planned. Her innocence and moral clarity made her sensitive to the evil that permeated Hinterkaifeck, but her desperate need for employment and her trust in the apparent respectability of her employers made her willing to ignore warning signs that should have sent her fleeing immediately. The timing of Maria's arrival seemed too perfect to be coincidental, as if whoever was orchestrating the family's destruction had been waiting for the addition of this final victim before proceeding with their ultimate plans. Her presence completed the cast of characters required for the drama that was about to unfold, providing the innocent outsider whose murder would transform a private family tragedy into a public horror that would shock the entire region. As the sun set on March 31st, 1922, the harbingers of doom had completed their work, creating conditions that would make the upcoming massacre both inevitable and devastating in its thoroughness. The family that had spent decades corrupting themselves through incest, abuse, and moral degradation had attracted the attention of something far more twisted and dangerous than their own domestic evil. The watchers had finished their preparation, the stage had been set, and the final act was about to begin. The harbingers had done their work, and now it was time for the main event, a display of systematic violence that would transform Hinterkaifeck from a private hell into a public monument to the ultimate consequences of moral corruption and willful blindness to approaching danger. The doom that had been so carefully harboured was about to break free, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 6. The Innocent Arrives. March 31st, 1922. Maria Baumgartner walked toward Hinterkaifeck on the afternoon of March 31st, with the determined stride of a woman who had finally found employment after weeks of desperate searching, her modest suitcase containing everything she owned in the world, and her heart filled with gratitude toward the prosperous farming family who had offered her a position when so many others had turned her away. At 44, she possessed the kind of practical competence and moral steadiness that made her an ideal domestic servant, qualities that would prove to be both her greatest assets and her ultimate doom in the twisted household she was about to enter. The journey from her lodgings in the village to the isolated farmstead took her through dense woodland that seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with each step, as if the very trees were trying to warn her away from her destination. But Maria was a woman of simple faith and practical concerns, more worried about making a good impression on her new employers than about the atmospheric peculiarities of the Bavarian countryside. She had been unemployed for 3 months, her savings exhausted and her options dwindling, making this opportunity seem like divine providence rather than the trap it actually represented. Her sister had accompanied her partway on the journey, providing moral support and helping to carry her few belongings. But even this small gesture of family solidarity had been tainted by an undercurrent of unease that neither woman could articulate. The sister departed quickly after reaching the edge of the Gruber property, claiming urgent business back in town but actually responding to an instinctive revulsion that she would later describe as feeling like she was abandoning Maria to something terrible and inescapable. Andreas Gruber greeted Maria at the farmhouse door with the kind of practiced charm that he had perfected over decades of concealing his true nature from outsiders. His handshake was firm, his smile was warm, and his manner suggested the sort of patriarchal authority that many women of Maria's generation found reassuring in an employer. She had no way of knowing that the same hands now welcoming her to his home had spent years systematically violating his own daughter, or that the authority he projected was built on a foundation of incestuous abuse and psychological manipulation. Victoria's welcome was more subdued but no less deceptive, her manner suggesting the kind of weary resignation that might be expected from a war widow struggling to maintain a household with limited resources. Maria interpreted Victoria's emotional distance as evidence of grief and hardship, rather than as the psychological numbness of a woman who had been so thoroughly corrupted that she could no longer experience normal human emotions. The maternal tenderness that Maria expected to see in a woman caring for young children had been systematically destroyed by years of participating in her own degradation. The children's behaviour during Maria's initial tour of the household should have provided immediate warning signs that something was fundamentally wrong with the family dynamics, but her lack of experience with severely traumatised children made her misinterpret their responses as mere shyness rather than fear. 7-year-old Cecilia clung to her mother with desperate intensity, while avoiding all eye contact with her grandfather, behaviour that suggested she already understood her place in the family's corrupt hierarchy and was terrified of attracting Andreas's attention. 2-year-old Josef's reaction to Maria's presence was even more disturbing, though she lacked the expertise to recognise the signs of a child who had been systematically conditioned to expect violence from adults. His unusual stillness and hypervigilance suggested a survival instinct that had been activated far too early in his development, but Maria attributed his behaviour to the natural wariness that many young children displayed around strangers. The farmhouse itself seemed to whisper warnings to anyone sensitive enough to hear them, its walls holding decades of secrets, and its atmosphere heavy with the kind of psychological residue that accumulates in places where terrible things have happened repeatedly. Maria felt the oppressive weight of the house's history without understanding its source, experiencing a vague sense of unease that she attributed to the natural adjustment period required when entering a new employment situation. Her assigned quarters in the small room adjacent to the kitchen placed her at the geographical centre of the household's daily activities, while isolating her from potential escape routes in ways that seemed designed for maximum vulnerability rather than convenience. The room's single window faced the interior courtyard rather than the forest path that led to safety, ensuring that any attempt at flight would be immediately visible to the family members who had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats to their secrecy. The evening meal that marked Maria's first full day of employment revealed the extent to which normal family interactions had been systematically perverted by years of corruption and abuse. The conversation was stilted and artificial, with each family member playing roles that bore no relationship to their actual psychological states or interpersonal dynamics. Andreas dominated the discussion with the kind of forced joviality that predators often employ to maintain their victims' compliance, while Victoria contributed only when directly addressed, and the children remained silent unless specifically commanded to speak. Maria's attempts to engage with the family in the natural, warm manner that had made her successful in previous positions met with responses that should have alerted her to the artificial nature of their apparent normalcy. Her questions about local customs and community events were deflected or answered in ways that made it clear the family had deliberately isolated itself from normal social connections. Her offers to help with household tasks beyond her assigned duties were received with a kind of suspicious resistance that suggested the family had something to hide about their daily routines. The sounds that began emanating from the attic shortly after Maria retired for the night on her first evening at Hinterkaifeck provided the clearest possible warning that she had entered a situation that threatened her safety and potentially her life. The footsteps that paced back and forth above her room followed patterns that no legitimate resident of the household would produce, suggesting the presence of someone who was deliberately trying to intimidate and unsettle the new arrival. Maria's response to these disturbances revealed both her courage and her fatal inability to recognize the systematic nature of the threat she faced. Rather than fleeing immediately or demanding an explanation from her employers, she chose to endure the supernatural harassment with the kind of patient resignation that working-class women of her generation had been taught to display when confronted with circumstances beyond their control. Her attempts to discuss the nocturnal disturbances with Victoria the following morning met with the kind of dismissive responses that should have convinced her that the family was either complicit in creating the threatening atmosphere or too damaged to provide protection from whatever was tormenting the household. Victoria's casual attitude toward obviously supernatural or criminal activity suggested that she'd become so accustomed to living with evil that she could no longer distinguish between normal and abnormal circumstances. The day's work routine that Victoria outlined for Maria seemed designed more to keep her busy and distracted than to accomplish any meaningful domestic tasks. The assignments scattered her throughout the property at times when she would be most vulnerable to attack while ensuring that she would be isolated from potential sources of help or intervention. The schedule also guaranteed that she would be alone in the house during periods when the family members' whereabouts could not be easily verified. Maria's growing unease throughout her single day of employment at Hinterkaifeck reflected the natural response of a psychologically healthy person to an environment saturated with malevolence and deception. Her instincts warned her that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation, but her economic desperation and social conditioning made her reluctant to abandon a position she desperately needed without concrete evidence of danger. The final hours of Maria's life were spent in activities that seemed deliberately designed to maximize her vulnerability, while providing her employers with detailed knowledge of her habits, capabilities, and potential responses to threatening situations. Her meal preparation duties placed her in the kitchen with access to knives and other potential weapons, but also isolated her from escape routes and made her visible to observers who might be monitoring the household from concealed positions. As evening approached on March 31st, Maria Baumgartner completed her domestic tasks with the thoroughness and attention to detail that had made her a valued employee in previous positions, unaware that she was preparing for her own death with the same careful efficiency she brought to all her work. Her prayers before retiring for the night included gratitude for her new position and requests for divine protection that would go unanswered in the most terrible possible way. The innocent had arrived, the final piece had been placed on the board, and the stage was set for a display of systematic violence that would transform a simple domestic arrangement into one of Germany's most notorious unsolved murders. Maria Baumgartner had walked unknowingly into a trap that had been carefully prepared by people who viewed her not as a human being deserving of protection and respect, but as raw material for the satisfaction of appetites that had grown beyond all normal boundaries. Her innocence, which should have protected her from the corruption that had consumed the Gruber family, instead made her the perfect victim for whatever climactic violence had been planned. The woman who had sought nothing more than honest employment and a chance to rebuild her life had instead found herself in the centre of a web of evil that would soon claim not just her life, but the lives of everyone who shared her fate at Hinterkaifeck. The innocent had arrived, and her presence had triggered the final countdown to a massacre that would shock Germany and create a mystery that would endure for generations. The trap was set, the victims were in position, and the only question remaining was when the predator would decide to spring the deadly mechanism that would transform Hinterkaifeck from a farmstead into a charnel house. The stage was set for slaughter, and Maria Baumgartner's arrival had provided the final element necessary to begin the bloodiest night in Bavarian history. Now, Chapter 7. The slaughter begins, evening of March 31st, 1922. Darkness fell over Hinterkaifeck like a shroud on the evening of March 31st, carrying with it the weight of accumulated evil and the promise of violence that had been building toward this moment for months. The farmstead crouched in its forest clearing like a wounded animal waiting to die, its windows glowing with the deceptive warmth of lamplight that concealed the horror about to unfold within its corrupted walls. The killer moved through the shadows with the patience of a predator who had spent endless hours studying his prey, understanding their routines, their weaknesses, and their capacity for terror. The weapon chosen for the night's work was a mattock that belonged to the farm itself, a tool designed for breaking hard earth and cutting through roots that would prove equally effective at shattering human skulls and severing the fragile connections between life and death. The killer's selection of this particular instrument revealed both practical intelligence and a twisted sense of poetic justice. The Gruber family would be destroyed by the very implements they had used to cultivate their corrupt existence on the cursed soil of Hinterkaifeck. The first victim was lured to the barn through a deception so simple and effective that it revealed the killer's intimate knowledge of the family's psychology and their fatal inability to recognize genuine danger even when it was approaching with deadly intent. Andreas Gruber, despite months of increasingly obvious warnings that his household was being stalked, responded to the nighttime summons with the arrogance of a man who believed his own capacity for evil made him immune to destruction by others. The barn that had once sheltered innocent animals and stored the fruits of honest labour had been transformed by decades of corruption into something that seemed to hunger for violence, its shadows deep enough to conceal the most terrible acts and its isolation complete enough to muffle the sounds of systematic murder. The killer had chosen his killing ground with the same careful attention to detail that characterized every other aspect of his campaign against the Gruber family. Andreas's death was swift but not merciful. the mattock falling with the precision of someone who understood both human anatomy and the most efficient methods for ending life through trauma to the skull. The first blow stunned rather than killed, leaving the patriarch of this corrupt dynasty conscious enough to understand that his years of victimizing others had finally attracted the attention of a superior predator. His attempts to speak were cut short by the second blow, which shattered his ability to form words while leaving him aware enough to experience the full horror of his approaching death. The killer's treatment of Andreas revealed a psychological sophistication that transcended simple bloodlust or opportunistic violence. This was not the work of someone who killed for pleasure or profit, but rather the methodical elimination of a target who had been judged and found worthy of destruction. The systematic nature of the attack suggested that Andreas's death was not an end in itself, but merely the opening movement in a symphony of violence that would encompass the entire household. Victoria was summoned to the barn through a deception that exploited her psychological dependence on her father and her inability to function independently when faced with genuine crisis. Her arrival at the scene of Andreas's murder should have triggered flight or resistance, but years of systematic abuse had destroyed her capacity for self-preservation in favour of the kind of passive compliance that made her an ideal victim for someone who understood how to exploit psychological damage. Her death was more prolonged than her father's, not because the killer took pleasure in her suffering, but because her psychological conditioning made her incapable of the kind of resistance that would have forced him to end her life quickly. She submitted to destruction with the same terrible obedience that had characterized her response to years of incestuous abuse. Her final moments marked not by struggle, but by a kind of grateful acceptance that her suffering was finally coming to an end. The killer's treatment of Victoria revealed his understanding of the complex dynamics that had shaped her relationship with her father and her role in perpetuating the family's corruption. Her death was both punishment for her complicity in Andreas's crimes and a kind of twisted mercy that freed her from circumstances that had made normal human existence impossible. The mattock that shattered her skull also shattered the chains that had bound her to a life of systematic degradation. Old Cecilia Gruber's summons to the barn represented the killer's understanding that the matriarch's passive enabling of her husband's crimes made her as culpable as more active participants in the family's corruption. Her advanced age and physical frailty made her an easy target, but the killer's treatment of her revealed that he viewed her not as a helpless elderly woman, but as a knowing accomplice who had chosen complicity over protection when her daughter needed rescue from systematic abuse. Her death was accomplished with the same efficient brutality that had characterized the elimination of her husband and daughter, the mattock falling with mechanical precision that suggested the killer had moved beyond emotional responses to his work and was now functioning with the detached professionalism of someone who viewed murder as a necessary task to be completed with maximum efficiency. 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel's participation in the barn killings represented the most horrific aspect of the evening's violence, the destruction of innocence that had already been compromised by her exposure to her grandfather's corrupt influence. Her summons to join the adult victims in the barn suggested that the killer understood the family's dynamics well enough to know that she had been groomed for eventual inclusion in Andreas's sexual abuse and was therefore already marked for destruction by her association with the household's evil. But unlike the adults who had died quickly from their injuries, young Cecilia survived the initial attack with enough consciousness and mobility to understand that she was surrounded by the corpses of her family members and that her own death was approaching with terrible inevitability. Her survival for several hours after the attack created a pocket of living horror in the midst of systematic slaughter, her small hands tearing out clumps of her own hair as she lay dying among the bodies of everyone she had ever known. The killer's decision to leave the child alive during the transition from barn to house suggested either careless workmanship or a deliberate choice to maximize the psychological impact of the massacre. Young Cecilia's prolonged agony served no practical purpose in the elimination of witnesses, but it added a dimension of sadistic sophistication that transformed simple murder into psychological torture on a scale that challenged conventional understanding of human cruelty. The movement from barn to house marked a shift in the killer's methodology, from luring victims to their deaths in a carefully prepared killing ground to hunting them in their most private spaces where they had every reason to expect safety and protection. The violation of the domestic sanctuary represented an escalation in psychological warfare that demonstrated the killer's understanding of how to maximize terror through the systematic destruction of his victims' most basic assumptions about security. Maria Baumgartner's death in her assigned quarters revealed the killer's particular attention to the innocent outsider whose only crime had been accepting employment in a household that had attracted forces beyond her comprehension or ability to resist. Her murder was accomplished with the same efficient brutality that had characterized the barn killings, but her isolation from the other victims suggested that the killer viewed her as fundamentally different from the corrupted family members who had earned their destruction through decades of moral compromise. The positioning of Maria's body and the manner of her death suggested that she had been killed while sleeping, sparing her the terror and awareness that had marked the final moments of the other adult victims. This comparative mercy might have reflected the killer's recognition that Maria bore no responsibility for the evil that had attracted his attention to Hinterkaifeck, or it might simply have been the result of practical considerations related to maintaining silence during the completion of his work. 2-year-old Joseph's death in his crib represented the final act in the systematic elimination of the Gruber bloodline, the destruction of innocence so complete that it challenged the very concept of justice or proportionate punishment. The infant had no capacity to understand what was happening to him or why, making his murder an act of pure annihilation that transcended conventional categories of crime or warfare. The killer's treatment of Yosef revealed the absolute nature of his commitment to eliminating every trace of the corruption that had taken root at Hinterkaifeck. The infant's death served no practical purpose in terms of eliminating witnesses or preventing discovery, but it completed the symbolic destruction of a family line that had become so twisted and poisonous that even its youngest members were viewed as beyond redemption. As the final blow fell and silence settled over the farmstead, the killer had accomplished something that went beyond simple murder or even systematic extermination. He had performed a kind of surgical removal of corruption, cutting away a cancer that had metastasized throughout the isolated household and threatened to spread its poison to anyone who came into contact with its influence. The slaughter was complete, but the killer's work was far from finished. The night had only begun, and the most psychologically disturbing phase of his campaign was yet to come. The bodies stacked in the barn and scattered through the house represented not the conclusion of violence, but merely its first act. The opening movement in a symphony of horror that would transform Hinterkaifeck from the scene of a massacre into something far more twisted and incomprehensible. The killer moved through the blood-soaked farmstead with the satisfaction of someone who had completed the first phase of a complex project, but his true work was only beginning. The dead had served their purpose, but their corpses would now serve another, even more disturbing function in a psychological campaign that would challenge every assumption about the nature of human evil and the boundaries of moral comprehension. The slaughter had begun, but the real horror was yet to come. Chapter 8. The Child's Agony. March, 31st April Wast, 1922. In the hellish aftermath of systematic slaughter, when the barn floor ran red with the blood of 4 human beings, and the farmhouse echoed with the silence of the dead, one small voice continued to whisper in the darkness, the fading breath of 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel, whose resilient young body refused to surrender to death as quickly as the adults who lay stacked around her, like cordwood in the killing ground that had once been a place of innocent agricultural work. The mattock that had shattered her grandfather's skull and destroyed her mother's capacity for thought had struck the child with less precision, perhaps because the killer found it difficult to adjust his technique for such a small target, or perhaps because some vestige of humanity in his corrupted soul had prevented him from delivering the kind of efficient death blow that would have ended her suffering immediately. Instead, the weapon had cracked her skull without penetrating to the brain's vital centers, leaving her trapped in a twilight existence between life and death that would stretch through the longest night in Bavarian history. Consciousness returned to young Cecilia in fragments, each moment of awareness bringing fresh understanding of the horror that surrounded her and the hopelessness of her situation. The first sensation was pain, a crushing weight that seemed to press down on her entire head, while sharp fragments of agony shot through her skull with every heartbeat. But worse than the physical torment was the gradual realization that she was lying in something warm and sticky that her damaged mind slowly recognized as blood, not just her own, but the mingled life essence of everyone she had ever loved. The barn that had once seemed like a magical place where animals lived and farm work was accomplished with satisfying routine had been transformed into a charnel house where human beings had been reduced to broken meat and scattered bone. The familiar sounds of contented livestock had been replaced by the terrible silence of violent death, broken only by her own laboured breathing and the occasional creak of timber settling under the weight of accumulated horror. Her attempts to call for help produced only weak whimpers that barely disturbed the oppressive quiet that had settled over Hinterkaifeck like a burial shroud. The massive head trauma she had sustained had damaged her ability to form coherent words, reducing her desperate pleas for salvation to primitive sounds that no one was alive to hear or respond to. The isolation that had protected her family's shameful secrets for decades now ensured that her final hours would be spent in absolute solitude, surrounded by corpses but utterly alone. The physical positioning of the bodies around her created a grotesque tableau that would have challenged the sanity of any adult observer, but for a child whose understanding of death was still abstract and incomplete, the scene represented a puzzle that her damaged mind struggled to comprehend. Her grandfather Andreas lay closest to her, his familiar face transformed by violence into something unrecognizable, while her mother Victoria had been arranged nearby in a position that suggested the killer had taken time to organize his victims according to some system that made sense only to his twisted psychology. Old Cecilia Gruber, the grandmother whose stern discipline had shaped the child's earliest understanding of adult authority, completed the family grouping in death as she had in life, her body positioned to create a kind of domestic arrangement that mocked the normal relationships that had never truly existed within the corrupted household. The killer's decision to stack the bodies rather than leaving them where they fell suggested a psychological compulsion toward organization that transcended simple practical considerations about concealment or disposal. Young Cecilia's gradual understanding that everyone she had ever known was dead and that she was dying among their corpses triggered a psychological response that went beyond simple terror into realms of existential horror that no child should ever be forced to explore. Her damaged mind began to construct explanations for what had happened that drew on the fairy tales and folk stories that had formed her earliest understanding of good and evil, creating a narrative framework that could accommodate the incomprehensible reality of systematic family annihilation. The pain that radiated through her skull made coherent thought increasingly difficult, but in her moments of clarity she began to understand that the strange sounds and supernatural manifestations that had been tormenting the household in recent weeks had been building toward this moment of ultimate destruction. The footsteps in the attic, the mysterious appearances of foreign objects, and the general atmosphere of impending doom had all been harbingers of the violence that had finally consumed her family. Her attempts to move were frustrated by the severity of her injuries and her weakening condition, but she possessed enough mobility to explore her immediate environment with the kind of desperate curiosity that marks children even in the face of mortal peril. Her small hands encountered fragments of bone and tissue that her innocent mind could not immediately categorize, while her fingers became sticky with substances that she gradually recognized as the blood and brain matter of people who had been alive and familiar just hours earlier. The most psychologically devastating discovery was her mother's hand, still warm and recognizable despite the violence that had destroyed the rest of Victoria's body. Young Cecilia's attempts to wake her mother by squeezing her fingers and whispering her name represented the ultimate expression of childhood faith in parental protection, the belief that maternal love could overcome even death itself. The gradual cooling of that beloved hand marked the moment when hope finally died in the child's damaged heart. As the hours passed and her condition continued to deteriorate, young Cecilia began exhibiting behaviours that would later provide investigators with their most disturbing physical evidence of the massacre's aftermath. The clumps of her own hair that she tore from her scalp in apparent desperation or delirium created a scattered trail of suffering that told the story of prolonged agony in ways that no adult testimony could match. The psychological significance of this self-inflicted hair removal transcended simple physical response to trauma, representing instead a kind of primitive ritual behaviour that children sometimes display when confronted with circumstances that exceed their capacity for rational comprehension. The act of pulling out her own hair might have been an attempt to distract herself from the crushing pain in her skull, or it might have been a form of self-punishment based on the child's assumption that she was somehow responsible for the destruction that had consumed her family. The killer's decision to leave the barn after completing the adult murders meant that young Cecilia's final hours were spent in complete isolation, surrounded by the evidence of systematic violence but receiving no comfort, medical attention, or even acknowledgement of her continued existence. This abandonment represented a cruelty that went beyond the physical violence of the initial attack, transforming her death from a quick execution into a prolonged torture that seemed designed to maximize psychological trauma. The sounds that occasionally reached her from the main house during her final night of life suggested that the killer had not fled after completing the murders, but was instead continuing to occupy the property for reasons that her damaged mind could not begin to comprehend. The knowledge that her family's murderer was still present, possibly planning additional violence or simply enjoying the aftermath of his work, added another dimension of terror to circumstances that had already exceeded any reasonable definition of childhood nightmare. Her attempts to escape from the barn were frustrated by her physical condition and the systematic way in which the killer had positioned the bodies to create barriers to movement. Whether this arrangement was intentionally designed to trap her among the corpses, or was simply the result of the killer's compulsive need for organization, it ensured that her final hours would be spent in intimate contact with the evidence of her family's destruction. The gradual onset of delirium brought temporary relief from the full awareness of her situation, but it also created hallucinations and distorted perceptions that transformed the already horrific reality into something even more nightmarish. Her damaged brain began to people the barn with phantoms and monsters drawn from the darkest corners of childhood imagination, creatures that seemed to emerge from the pools of blood and the shadows cast by her family's corpses. As dawn approached on April 1st, young Cecilia Gabriel's remarkable constitution finally began to surrender to the massive trauma she had sustained. Her breathing became more laboured, her periods of consciousness grew shorter and less coherent, and her small body began the final process of shutting down that would end nearly 12 hours of unimaginable suffering. Her death, when it finally came with the first light of what should have been a beautiful spring morning, represented not just the end of individual human life, but the completion of a cycle of violence that had consumed an entire family line. The last member of a dynasty that had been corrupted by incest, abuse, and moral degradation had finally succumbed to injuries inflicted by someone whose capacity for evil exceeded even their own twisted standards. The child's agony had ended, but the psychological impact of her prolonged suffering would resonate through every aspect of the investigation that followed. The evidence of her desperate attempts to survive, the physical traces of her final struggles, and the horrific circumstances of her death would provide investigators with insights into the killer's psychology that went far beyond simple criminal profiling. Young Cecilia Gabriel had become both victim and witness to one of Germany's most brutal family annihilations, her prolonged survival serving as a testament to the resilience of human life, even under the most extreme circumstances. Her death marked the end of innocence at Hinterkaifeck and the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Bavaria for generations to come. The child's suffering was over, but the horror she had witnessed and endured would live on in the evidence she left behind and the questions that her tragic fate would raise about the nature of evil and the capacity of human beings to inflict unimaginable cruelty on the most vulnerable members of society. Chapter 9. Living Among the Dead, April 3, 1922. For 3 days and 3 nights, something walked through the blood-soaked chambers of Hinterkaifeck with the casual domesticity of a householder, attending to daily chores, stepping over corpses with the same indifference most people reserve for furniture, and conducting the mundane business of eating, sleeping, and maintaining property as if the systematic massacre that had transformed the farmstead into a charnel house was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be worked around rather than evidence of the most depraved criminal act in Bavarian history. The killer's decision to remain at the scene of his crimes revealed a psychology so alien to normal human experience that it challenged every assumption about criminal behavior and the relationship between violence and guilt. Most murderers flee immediately after their acts, driven by instinctive recognition that they have crossed fundamental moral boundaries and must escape before facing consequences for their violations of human law and divine command. But the creature who had methodically destroyed the Gruber family possessed no such moral compass no internal mechanism that registered the taking of human life as fundamentally different from any other form of problem-solving. The domestic routine that emerged during those 3 days of cohabitation with death demonstrated an organizational intelligence that was perhaps even more disturbing than the violence that had preceded it. The killer moved through the farmstead with obvious familiarity, tending to the livestock with competent efficiency, maintaining the fires that kept the buildings warm, and consuming the family's food stores with the methodical appetite of someone who viewed sustenance as a practical necessity rather than an emotional or social activity. The animals that had witnessed the massacre responded to their new caretaker with the kind of confused acceptance that domestic creatures display when their familiar human companions are replaced by strangers who nonetheless understand their basic needs. The cattle were milked on schedule, the chickens were fed and watered, and the farm's working dog received enough attention to prevent him from creating disturbances that might attract unwanted attention from neighbours or passing travellers. This systematic attention to agricultural maintenance revealed the killer's understanding that any deviation from the property's normal routines might trigger investigation by neighbours or authorities who expected certain patterns of activity to continue, regardless of whatever private dramas might be unfolding within the isolated household. The smoke that continued to rise from Hinterkaifeck's chimneys served as a signal that life proceeded normally behind the farmstead's walls, while the sounds of routine farm work provided auditory evidence that nothing had fundamentally changed in the daily operations. The killer's consumption of the family's food stores during his 3-day residence revealed both practical necessity and a psychological callousness that transcended normal categories of criminal behaviour. He ate meals prepared with ingredients that belonged to his victims, using their plates and utensils while their bodies decomposed nearby, apparently experiencing no revulsion or emotional conflict about consuming sustenance in such circumstances. The bread that disappeared entirely during his stay had been baked by hands that were now cold and lifeless, yet he consumed it with the same mechanical efficiency he brought to all his activities. The sleeping arrangements that the killer established during his residence at Hinterkaifeck suggested either complete emotional detachment from his crimes or a form of psychological pathology that enabled him to find comfort in spaces saturated with the evidence of his violence, whether he slept in one of the family's beds, surrounded by their personal belongings and the lingering scent of their presence, or created alternative accommodations that avoided direct contact with their domestic spaces. His ability to rest peacefully so close to his victims demonstrated a separation from normal human moral responses that bordered on the supernatural. The killer's movements throughout the property during daylight hours required careful attention to concealment and timing, as the farmstead's isolation was not complete enough to guarantee that his presence would go unnoticed by neighbours, travelling merchants, or other visitors who might have legitimate business with the Gruber family. His success in maintaining the appearance of normal household activity while conducting his macabre residence among the dead suggested intimate knowledge of local traffic patterns and social expectations. The maintenance of fires throughout the 3-day period served multiple practical and psychological purposes, providing warmth and cooking facilities while creating the smoke signals that convinced distant observers that life continued normally at Hinterkaifeck. But the fires also served a more sinister function, potentially consuming evidence of the killer's presence or activities that might have provided crucial clues for later investigators. The ashes that accumulated during his stay would later be examined for traces of burned materials that might reveal his identity or methods, but any such evidence had been thoroughly destroyed by the time authorities gained access to the property. The killer's interaction with the family's personal belongings during his residence revealed a psychological complexity that went beyond simple criminal opportunism or practical necessity. Rather than looting valuable items for financial gain, he seemed more interested in exploring the intimate details of his victims' private lives, examining their correspondence, clothing, and personal effects with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested he was conducting research rather than simple theft. This forensic examination of the family's possessions provided the killer with detailed insights into their relationships, financial circumstances, and social connections that might have informed decisions about how long he could safely remain at the property without triggering unwanted attention. His apparent reading of their personal papers and examination of their financial records demonstrated an intelligence that extended far beyond the capacity for violence, suggesting criminal sophistication that transcended simple murderous impulse. The psychological impact of living among corpses for 3 days would have been devastating for any normally constituted human being, but the killer's apparent comfort with such circumstances suggested either complete emotional deadness or a form of pathological adaptation that enabled him to derive satisfaction from proximity to the evidence of his violence. The decomposition that began during his stay would have filled the buildings with increasingly unpleasant odours, yet he continued his domestic routine without apparent distress or urgency to conclude his residence. The killer's treatment of the bodies themselves during his 3-day stay remained one of the most disturbing aspects of his post-murder behaviour. Rather than attempting to conceal or dispose of the evidence of his crimes, he seemed content to allow the corpses to remain where they had fallen or been arranged, occasionally moving around them, but making no systematic effort to eliminate the physical traces of his violence. This casual acceptance of decomposing human remains as part of his temporary living environment demonstrated a psychological relationship with death that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature. The sounds that the killer produced during his residence, footsteps, voices, and other evidence of human activity, were carefully modulated to maintain the impression that the Gruber family continued to occupy their home while avoiding the kind of social interactions that would have exposed his deception. His ability to mimic the household's normal acoustic patterns suggested either intimate knowledge of their daily routines or exceptional skill at impersonation and vocal disguise. The killer's decision to conclude his residence on April 3rd appeared to be based on practical considerations related to the increasing risk of discovery, rather than any emotional or psychological pressure related to his crimes. The absence of the family from expected social and business obligations was beginning to generate concern among neighbours and associates, making continued occupation of the property increasingly dangerous for someone whose presence could not be legitimately explained. The final preparations for departure revealed the same methodical intelligence that had characterised every aspect of the killer's campaign against the Gruber family. Evidence was eliminated or concealed, the property was arranged to delay discovery of the crimes, and escape routes were prepared with careful attention to avoiding detection by potential witnesses or pursuing authorities. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the killer's departure was the casual manner in which he abandoned the scene of his crimes, apparently feeling no compulsion to provide closure, explanation, or justification for the destruction he had wrought. He simply concluded his business at Hinterkaifeck and moved on to whatever other activities occupied his attention, leaving behind a legacy of horror that would haunt the community for generations, while providing no answers to the questions that his actions had raised about the nature of evil and the capacity of human beings for unspeakable cruelty. The 3 days of living among the dead had ended, but the psychological impact of such behaviour would extend far beyond the immediate investigation into the murders themselves. The killer had demonstrated that human moral boundaries were more fragile than most people imagined, and that the capacity for casual coexistence with the evidence of systematic violence represented a form of evil that transcended conventional categories of criminal behaviour. The dead had served their purpose as victims, and now they had served an additional purpose as roommates in a domestic arrangement that challenged every assumption about the relationship between guilt and conscience, violence and remorse, murder and aftermath. The killer's 3-day residence at Hinterkaifeck had transformed a crime scene into something far more disturbing, a laboratory for exploring the outer boundaries of human moral corruption. The living had departed, leaving only the dead to tell their story, but that story would prove to be one of the most puzzling and horrifying chapters in the annals of German criminal history. The killer's casual domesticity among the corpses had created a mystery that would endure for generations, raising questions about human nature that no investigation would ever be able to answer completely. Chapter 10. The Silence of Evil. April 14, 1922. An unnatural quiet descended upon Hinterkaifeck after the killer's departure, a silence so profound and malevolent that it seemed to radiate outward from the blood-soaked farmstead, like concentric circles of psychological contamination, infecting the very landscape with the weight of unspeakable acts and unanswered questions. This was not the peaceful silence of rural tranquility or the temporary hush that follows the completion of honest work, but rather the oppressive stillness that settles over places where evil has achieved such perfect expression that even the natural world recoils in horror and denial. The forest that surrounded the isolated farmstead seemed to participate in this conspiracy of silence, its normally vibrant ecosystem of bird songs, insect hums, and rustling leaves muted as if the trees themselves understood that they had witnessed something that transcended the normal boundaries of predator and prey, hunter and hunted. The woodland creatures that had once moved freely through the property now avoided the area entirely, following instinctual patterns that suggested they could sense the psychic residue of systematic violence even when they lacked the intellectual capacity to understand its human significance. The domestic animals that remained on the property, the cattle, chickens, and farm dog who had survived the 3-day period of cohabitation with the killer, displayed behavioral changes that would have alerted any experienced observer to the fundamental alteration in their environment's moral atmosphere. The cattle gathered in the corners of their enclosures farthest from the buildings where the murders had occurred, refusing to graze in areas where they had previously been comfortable. The chickens remained huddled in their coops even when food was available outside, and the dog spent his time whimpering and pacing with the kind of neurotic energy that animals display when confronted with circumstances that exceed their capacity for psychological adaptation. But it was the human silence that proved most disturbing to the community members, who began to notice the absence of normal social and economic interactions that had previously connected Hinterkaifeck to the larger patterns of rural Bavarian life. The family's failure to appear for scheduled appointments, their absence from weekly market activities, and their lack of response to routine social obligations created gaps in the community's social fabric that gradually expanded from minor inconveniences into sources of genuine concern. Andreas Gruber's reputation as a reliable business partner and careful steward of his property made his sudden disappearance from normal commercial activities particularly noteworthy to neighbours and associates who had depended on his participation in the agricultural economy that sustained their remote corner of Bavaria. His failure to complete contracted work, honour financial obligations, or respond to business correspondence created a pattern of absence that suggested either serious illness or circumstances that prevented normal communication with the outside world. Young Cecilia's absence from school represented another breach in the expected routines that governed rural community life, particularly significant because her previous attendance had been regular and her academic performance had been satisfactory despite the obvious dysfunction in her home environment. Teachers and fellow students who had grown accustomed to her quiet presence in the classroom began to notice her absence in ways that transcended simple administrative record-keeping, sensing that something fundamental had changed in the delicate balance of relationships that sustained their small educational community. The family's failure to attend Sunday worship services provided another signal that their circumstances had changed dramatically, though their previous pattern of irregular church attendance meant that this absence was less immediately alarming than it might have been for more devoutly religious families. Still, their complete disappearance from community religious life contributed to the growing sense that the Gruber household had become disconnected from the social structures that provided stability and meaning to rural existence. Victoria's absence from the informal networks of communication and mutual support that connected rural women was perhaps most significant in terms of its psychological impact on the community's sense of security and continuity. Her previous participation in these feminine social structures had been limited by her family's shameful secrets and her own psychological damage, but her complete disappearance created a void that other women began to notice and discuss with increasing frequency and concern. The most immediate practical consequence of the family's silence was the disruption of economic relationships and business obligations that connected Hinterkaifeck to the larger agricultural community. Merchants who had scheduled deliveries found no one available to receive their goods, while craftsmen who had been contracted to perform maintenance work discovered that their services were no longer needed or wanted. These commercial interruptions created financial inconveniences that gradually escalated into genuine hardships for small business owners who depended on regular payment for services rendered. But beyond these practical disruptions, the silence that emanated from Hinterkaifeck began to affect the psychological atmosphere of the entire community in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Rural communities depend on predictable patterns of social interaction and mutual obligation to maintain their sense of security and continuity, and the sudden absence of an entire household from these networks created anxieties that went far beyond simple concern for the missing family's welfare. The first visitors to approach the property during the period of unnatural silence found themselves confronting an atmosphere so oppressive and threatening that several turned back before reaching the main buildings, unable to explain their reluctance to complete their intended business, but nonetheless convinced that something terrible had occurred within the farmstead's boundaries. These instinctive responses to the psychic residue of violence demonstrated the community's unconscious recognition that Hinterkaifeck had been transformed from a familiar domestic space into something alien and dangerous. Hans and Edward Shirovsky, the coffee merchants who arrived on April 1st to take an order from the Gruber family, encountered the first tangible evidence that normal life had ceased at the isolated farmstead. Their discovery that no one responded to knocks on doors or windows, combined with their observation that the gate to the machine room stood open in violation of the family's usual security practices, should have triggered immediate investigation, or at least reports to local authorities about potential problems at the property. Instead, the merchants chose to interpret these warning signs as evidence of temporary absence rather than permanent departure, demonstrating the psychological resistance that community members displayed when confronted with evidence that challenged their assumptions about the safety and predictability of rural life. Their decision to leave without further investigation represented a missed opportunity to discover the massacre while physical evidence was still fresh, and the killer's trail might have been followed successfully. The silence that greeted Albert Hoffner, the mechanic who arrived on April 4th to repair farm equipment, was even more ominous because his work required him to spend several hours on the property while waiting for the family to return from whatever business was keeping them away from home. His ability to complete his repairs without encountering any family members should have alerted him to the possibility that something had prevented their return, yet he too chose to interpret their absence as routine rather than alarming. Hoffner's later testimony about his April 4th visit to Hinterkaifeck revealed the extent to which community members had unconsciously collaborated in maintaining the silence that protected the killer's escape and delayed discovery of the crimes. His description of the oppressive atmosphere he encountered, the unusual behaviour of the farm animals, and the general sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the property's environment provided crucial insights into the psychological impact of unresolved violence on sensitive observers. The decision by Lorenz Schlittenbauer to send his young son and stepson to investigate the family's continued absence represented the community's growing recognition that normal explanations for the silence at Hinterkaifeck were no longer adequate to account for the complete breakdown in communication and social interaction. The children's report that they had seen no signs of human activity confirmed adult suspicions that circumstances at the farmstead had changed dramatically. But even this clear evidence of abnormal conditions was not sufficient to trigger immediate adult investigation, demonstrating the psychological barriers that community members had erected against acknowledging the possibility that genuine tragedy had occurred in their midst. The rural Bavarian community's investment in maintaining beliefs about the safety and predictability of their environment made them reluctant to confront evidence that challenged these fundamental assumptions about the nature of their world. The silence that had settled over Hinterkaifeck during those first days of April 1922 was not merely the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something far more sinister. The weight of unacknowledged truth, the pressure of suppressed recognition, and the psychological resistance of an entire community to accepting that evil, of unprecedented scope, had manifested itself in their midst. This silence protected the killer's escape, delayed the discovery of evidence, and allowed the psychological contamination of the crime scene to spread throughout the surrounding area like a slow-acting poison that would affect community relationships and individual psychologies for generations to come. The evil that had consumed the Gruber family was now consuming the community's capacity for honest confrontation with reality, creating a conspiracy of denial that served the interests of whoever had orchestrated the massacre. The silence of evil had achieved its purpose, creating conditions that would ensure the killer's crime would become not just a successful murder, but a perfect mystery that would challenge investigators for decades while haunting the collective consciousness of rural Bavaria with questions that might never find satisfactory answers. The dead could not speak, the living would not listen, and the silence grew deeper with each passing hour. Protecting secrets that the community was not yet prepared to confront and preserving mysteries that would endure long after the physical evidence of the crime had been discovered and documented. Chapter 11. The Revelation of Horror, April 4th, 1922, The breaking of silence at Hinterkaifeck came not with dramatic fanfare or supernatural manifestation, but with the mundane sound of human footsteps crunching across the farmyard gravel as Lorenz Schlittenbauer approached the property in the company of neighbours Michael Perl and Jakob Siegel, their faces set with the grim determination of men who had finally accepted that their continued avoidance of unpleasant possibilities was no longer sustainable in the face of mounting evidence that something terrible had befallen the isolated household. The afternoon of April 4th carried the false promise of spring renewal, with pale sunlight filtering through the forest canopy and early wildflowers beginning to emerge from the soil that had been frozen throughout the long Bavarian winter. But the beauty of the natural world served only to heighten the contrast with the human horror that awaited discovery within the farmstead's walls, creating a psychological dissonance that would haunt the investigators' memories for the remainder of their lives. Schlittenbauer's approach to the main buildings revealed the first concrete evidence that normal domestic life had ceased at Hinterkaifeck, as the doors that should have been open to welcome visitors remained stubbornly closed despite his increasingly urgent knocking and calling. The windows that should have framed familiar faces peering out to identify their guests reflected only empty interior spaces, while the silence that had settled over the property seemed to absorb his voice without producing any responsive sound from within the buildings. The discovery that all exterior doors were securely locked should have provided reassurance that the family had taken appropriate security measures before departing on whatever business was keeping them away from home, but instead it created additional anxiety about how they might have left the property without using their normal exits. The systematic nature of the security measures suggested deliberate preparation for extended absence, yet the lack of any explanation for their departure made such preparations seem ominous rather than routine. The decision to break through the gate leading to the barn represented the moment when the investigators crossed from passive concern into active intervention in circumstances that they suspected had moved beyond the boundaries of normal domestic crisis. The forced entry that this action required transformed them from worried neighbours into trespassers, but their growing conviction that the family's welfare was at stake made such legal niceties seem irrelevant compared to the moral imperative to discover what had happened to people who might be in desperate need of assistance. The barn door that yielded to their pressure opened onto a scene that challenged their capacity for rational comprehension, revealing not the orderly agricultural workspace they expected to find, but rather a charnel house where human beings had been reduced to broken meat and scattered bone through the application of systematic violence that exceeded anything in their collective experience of rural crime or domestic tragedy. The first body they encountered was that of Andreas Gruber, the patriarch whose domineering presence had shaped every aspect of his family's existence, but who now lay motionless and shattered, his authoritative voice silenced forever, and his capacity for inflicting suffering on others permanently ended by someone whose appetite for violence had exceeded even his own twisted standards. The mattock wounds that had destroyed his skull provided unmistakable evidence that his death had been neither natural nor accidental, while the positioning of his body suggested that he had been carefully arranged by someone who possessed both the physical strength and psychological callousness necessary to manipulate corpses. The discovery of Victoria's body near her father's corpse created a tableau that seemed to mock the incestuous relationship that had defined their adult interaction, while providing stark evidence that their shared corruption had attracted the attention of something even more twisted and dangerous than their own domestic evil. Her death wounds matched those that had killed Andreas, suggesting that the same weapon and the same calculating intelligence had been responsible for eliminating both primary participants in the family's systematic moral degradation. Old Casilia Gruber's corpse completed the adult grouping, her advanced age and physical frailty making her murder seem almost anticlimactic compared to the violence that had been necessary to subdue her younger and stronger family members. Yet her inclusion in the systematic slaughter demonstrated that the killer had made no distinction based on the victim's relative capacity for resistance or their degree of culpability in the family's corrupt activities. But it was the discovery of 7-year-old Casilia Gabriel's small body that transformed the investigators' horror from simple revulsion at violent death into something approaching psychological trauma that would affect their capacity for normal emotional response for the remainder of their lives. The evidence of her prolonged survival after the initial attack, the clumps of her own hair scattered around her corpse, the signs that she had moved and struggled during her final hours, created a narrative of suffering that exceeded the boundaries of what the human mind could process without fundamental alteration. The realization that a child had spent hours dying among the corpses of her family members, while her killer went about his domestic routine in the main house, added dimensions of cruelty to the crime that challenged every assumption the investigators had maintained about the nature of human evil and the boundaries of criminal behavior. The casual indifference to child suffering that such circumstances implied suggested a psychology so alien to normal human experience that it seemed almost supernatural in its complete absence of recognizable moral constraints. The movement from barn to house in search of the remaining family members required the investigators to steel themselves for additional discoveries that their experience with the adult corpses had in no way prepared them to handle. The transition from the agricultural space where systematic murder had been conducted to the domestic environment, where normal family life should have continued, created expectations about what they might find that proved to be woefully inadequate preparation for the reality that awaited them. Maria Baumgartner's body in her assigned quarters provided evidence that the killer's violence had extended beyond the corrupted family members to include an innocent outsider whose only crime had been accepting employment in a household that had attracted forces beyond her comprehension or ability to resist. Her death represented the destruction of innocence in its purest form, the elimination of someone who bore no responsibility for the evil that had attracted murderous attention to Hinterkaifeck. The discovery of 2-year-old Joseph's tiny corpse in his crib represented the ultimate violation of every moral boundary that separates civilized human behavior from pure animalistic savagery, the destruction of life so young and defenseless that it served no practical purpose in terms of eliminating witnesses or preventing discovery. The infant's murder demonstrated that the killer's commitment to violence extended beyond rational criminal calculation into realms of pure malevolence that seemed to derive satisfaction from the destruction of innocence itself. The investigators' initial response to the comprehensive nature of the massacre was characterized by a kind of psychological paralysis that reflected their complete lack of preparation for confronting evidence of systematic family annihilation conducted with such methodical thoroughness. Their training and experience had equipped them to handle individual murders motivated by passion, greed, or desperation. But the calculated elimination of 6 human beings across multiple age groups and relationship categories challenged every framework they possessed for understanding criminal behavior. The contamination of the crime scene that resulted from the investigators' shocked stumbling through the evidence would later complicate official efforts to reconstruct the sequence of events and identify potential clues about the killer's identity or methods. But their fumbling response was entirely understandable given the unprecedented nature of what they had discovered and the complete absence of established procedures for handling crime scenes of such magnitude and complexity. The decision to prepare meals in the farmhouse kitchen while surrounded by evidence of systematic murder demonstrated the extent to which the discovery had overwhelmed their capacity for normal decision-making and appropriate response to criminal evidence. This violation of crime scene integrity would later be criticized by professional investigators, but it reflected the psychological necessity of maintaining some connection to normal human activities when confronted with evidence of evil that exceeded their capacity for rational comprehension. The spread of news about the massacre throughout the local community created secondary waves of psychological trauma that extended the crime's impact far beyond the immediate victims and their discoverers. Rural communities depend on shared assumptions about safety and predictability to maintain their social cohesion, and the revelation that systematic family annihilation was possible in their midst shattered fundamental beliefs about the nature of their world and their capacity to protect themselves and their loved ones from similar threats. The transformation of Hinterkaifeck from familiar agricultural property into notorious crime scene created a psychological landmark that would affect community relationships and individual psychologies for generations to come. The farmstead had become a monument to the capacity for human evil that exceeded all previous local experience, a permanent reminder that the boundaries between civilization and savagery were far more fragile than anyone had previously imagined. The revelation of horror at Hinterkaifeck had accomplished more than simply exposing evidence of criminal activity. It had fundamentally altered the community's understanding of human nature and the potential for evil that existed within apparently normal rural environments. The innocence that had been destroyed extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass an entire way of life, that depended on trust, predictability, and shared moral boundaries. The investigators who had broken the silence at Hinterkaifeck had opened a door that could never be closed again, releasing knowledge into their community that would poison relationships and darken perspectives for decades to come. They had discovered not just evidence of crime, but proof that evil of unprecedented scope and sophistication could manifest itself anywhere, at any time, and among any group of people who possessed the misfortune to attract its attention. The horror had been revealed, but the questions it raised about human nature, criminal motivation, and community vulnerability would endure long after the physical evidence had been documented and the official investigation had been completed. The revelation at Hinterkaifeck had provided answers to some questions while creating many more that would never be satisfactorily resolved. Chapter 12. The Corruption Spreads. April 1922. The horror discovered at Hinterkaifeck proved to be contagious in ways that no one had anticipated, spreading through the rural Bavarian community like a psychological plague that infected everyone. It touched with suspicion, paranoia, and the kind of moral contamination that transforms neighbours into potential enemies and friends into objects of fear. The systematic family annihilation that had claimed 6 lives within the farmstead's walls created secondary victims throughout the surrounding area as the investigation's revelations shattered fundamental assumptions about human nature and community safety. Inspector Georg Gruber arrived from Munich with the confident bearing of a professional investigator who had handled numerous criminal cases and believed himself prepared for whatever evidence rural Bavaria might present. But his first examination of the crime scene revealed the inadequacy of conventional investigative techniques when confronted with violence that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior and challenged basic assumptions about human psychological limitations. The autopsy conducted by court physician Johann Baptist Aumüller in the barn where the murders had occurred represented a violation of both medical protocol and human dignity that reflected the investigators' growing realization that normal procedures were inadequate for handling evidence of such magnitude and complexity. The decision to perform post-mortem examinations in the same space where systematic slaughter had been conducted created an atmosphere of continuing horror that affected everyone involved in the official response. Aumüller's discovery that young Cecilia had survived for hours after the initial attack, pulling out her own hair in apparent agony while lying among the corpses of her family members, provided the investigation's most psychologically devastating evidence, while raising questions about the killer's psychology that no conventional criminal profile could adequately address. The casual indifference to child suffering that such circumstances implied suggested a form of evil that exceeded normal human capacity for cruelty. The removal of the victims' skulls for examination in Munich created additional trauma for community members who had known the deceased as living human beings rather than criminal evidence. The systematic decapitation of people who had been neighbours, business associates, and familiar faces at community gatherings transformed them into medical specimens, while denying their survivors the comfort of viewing recognisable remains during funeral proceedings. The investigation's initial focus on robbery as a potential motive revealed both the investigators' need to find rational explanations for irrational violence and their fundamental misunderstanding of the psychological forces that had attracted systematic murder to Hinterkaifeck. The discovery of substantial sums of money that had been left untouched by the killer eliminated simple theft as an explanation, while raising more disturbing questions about what had actually motivated such comprehensive destruction. The interrogation of travelling craftsmen, vagrants, and local residents suspected of potential involvement in the murders created an atmosphere of universal suspicion that poisoned relationships throughout the community and transformed normal social interactions into exercises in mutual surveillance and paranoid assessment. Everyone became a potential suspect, every conversation became a source of evidence, and every deviation from normal behaviour became grounds for official scrutiny. The revelation that the killer had remained at Hinterkaifeck for 3 days after completing the murders, consuming the family's food and maintaining their livestock while living among the decomposing corpses, created a new category of psychological horror that challenged every assumption about criminal behaviour and human nature. The casual domesticity with which the murderer had cohabited with his victims suggested a form of moral corruption that exceeded conventional categories of mental illness or criminal pathology. Local residents who had been questioned about their whereabouts during the relevant time period found themselves marked by association with the investigation, their reputations tainted by the mere suggestion that they might be capable of participating in such systematic violence. The social fabric of the community began to unravel as people who had trusted each other for decades started viewing familiar neighbours through the lens of suspicion and fear. The contamination of the crime scene by investigators, neighbours, and curiosity seekers who had moved through the evidence without proper precautions eliminated crucial physical clues while demonstrating the community's complete lack of preparation for handling criminal investigations of such magnitude. The cooking of meals in the murder house kitchen and the casual handling of potential evidence reflected psychological necessity rather than deliberate obstruction, but the damage to the investigation's integrity was nonetheless severe. The discovery of additional evidence during the farmstead's demolition in 1923, including the blood-covered mattock hidden in the attic and a mysterious penknife buried in the hay, suggested that the initial investigation had failed to uncover crucial clues that might have identified the killer or revealed his methods. But these revelations came too late to affect the official inquiry and served only to deepen the mystery surrounding the case. The psychological impact of the investigation on the officials responsible for solving the case created its own form of corruption, as experienced investigators found themselves confronted with evidence that challenged their fundamental beliefs about human nature and criminal motivation. The systematic elimination of an entire family, including small children, by someone who had then lived comfortably among the corpses, represented a form of evil that exceeded their professional and personal capacity for comprehension. Inspector Gruber's growing frustration with the case's resistance to conventional investigative techniques led to increasingly desperate attempts to find rational explanations for irrational violence, including the arrest and interrogation of numerous suspects whose only connection to the crime was their presence in the general area during the relevant time period. These fishing expeditions created additional victims as innocent people found their lives disrupted by association with Germany's most notorious unsolved murder. The media attention that the case attracted transformed Hinterkaifeck from a local tragedy into a national sensation, bringing journalists, curiosity seekers, and amateur investigators to the rural community in numbers that overwhelmed local resources, while creating additional opportunities for contamination of evidence and harassment of potential witnesses. The transformation of systematic murder into public entertainment added another layer of corruption to circumstances that were already psychologically devastating. The development of competing theories about the killer's identity and motivation created factions within the investigating team and the broader community, with different groups supporting various suspects and explanations based more on personal preferences and psychological needs than on actual evidence. These divisions further poisoned community relationships while preventing the kind of coordinated investigation that might have produced more definitive results. The interrogation of Lorenz Schlittenbauer revealed the extent to which the investigation had become contaminated by personal animosities and local politics as much as by genuine criminal inquiry. Schlittenbauer's suspicious behaviour at the crime scene and his intimate knowledge of the family's secrets made him a compelling suspect, but the evidence against him remained circumstantial, and his prosecution became entangled with broader questions about the community's complicity in covering up the family's shameful activities. The failure to develop conclusive evidence against any particular suspect created a psychological climate in which everyone remained under suspicion, while no one could be definitively cleared of involvement. This permanent state of unresolved accusation poisoned relationships throughout the community and created lasting damage to social trust that would affect the area for generations. The investigation's gradual acknowledgement that conventional detective work was inadequate for solving crimes of such psychological complexity marked a turning point in German criminal investigation, while providing no satisfaction to the community members who continued to live with the knowledge that a killer of unprecedented capability remained at large among them. The corruption that had begun with the Gruber family's incestuous activities had spread through their systematic murder to infect the entire investigative process, creating secondary and tertiary victims whose lives were damaged by association with evil they had neither created nor understood. The investigation itself became part of the crime's continuing impact, transforming potential helpers into additional casualties of violence that seemed to corrupt everything it touched. The search for justice had become another form of victimization, as the investigation's methods and assumptions proved inadequate for handling evidence of evil that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior. The corruption had spread beyond the boundaries of Hinterkaifeck to encompass everyone who came into contact with the case, creating a widening circle of psychological contamination that would continue to expand for decades after the physical evidence had been documented and filed away. The investigation's ultimate failure to identify the killer or provide satisfactory explanations for the massacre created a permanent wound in the community's collective psychology, a source of continuing fear and suspicion that would affect relationships and individual psychologies long after the official inquiry had been abandoned. The corruption had achieved a kind of immortality, ensuring that the evil manifested at Hinterkaifeck would continue to poison lives for generations to come. The investigators who had sought to contain and explain the horror had instead become its unwitting servants, spreading its influence throughout the community while failing to provide the resolution and closure that might have limited its psychological impact. The corruption that had consumed the Gruber family had proven to be far more contagious and durable than anyone had anticipated, transforming a criminal investigation into another chapter in the continuing story of evil's capacity to reproduce and spread itself through human communities. On Chapter 13, The Suspect's Darkness, 1922-1925. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck massacre became a journey through the hidden darkness that lurked within every member of the rural Bavarian community, revealing secrets, grudges, and capacity for violence that had previously been concealed beneath the facade of respectable agricultural life. Each suspect brought his own shadows to the inquiry, and the deeper investigators probed into their backgrounds and motivations, the more they discovered that evil of various forms had been festering throughout the region, like an infection waiting for the right conditions to manifest itself in systematic murder. Lorenz Schlittenbauer emerged as the primary suspect through a combination of circumstantial evidence, suspicious behavior, and the kind of intimate knowledge about the Gruber family's secrets that suggested either direct involvement in their destruction or complicity in creating the conditions that had made such violence inevitable. His relationship with Victoria Gabriel had provided him with detailed insights into the corrupt family dynamics, while creating potential motives for eliminating witnesses to activities that could have destroyed his reputation and social standing. Schlittenbauer's behavior at the crime scene revealed either the calculating intelligence of someone who had planned the murders carefully, or the psychological damage of a man who had become so accustomed to the Gruber family's twisted relationships that he could function normally even when confronted with evidence of their systematic destruction. His ability to unlock the farmhouse door without difficulty suggested prior possession of keys that should not have been available to him, while his decision to enter the building alone despite uncertainty about whether the killer might still be present demonstrated either remarkable courage or guilty knowledge about the safety of such actions. His disturbing of the crime scene through unnecessary movement and manipulation of the bodies created contamination that would complicate the official investigation while potentially eliminating evidence that might have incriminated him or exonerated other suspects. Whether this interference was deliberate sabotage or simply the result of shock and poor judgment remained unclear, but its impact on the investigation's integrity was undeniable and lasting. Schlittenbauer's intimate knowledge of details about the murders that had not been made public, including his comments about the frozen ground preventing proper burial of the bodies, suggested access to information that should have been available only to the killer or to someone who had conducted detailed examination of the crime scene before official investigators arrived. His explanation that such knowledge resulted from educated guessing based on local conditions was plausible, but unconvincing to investigators who suspected more direct involvement. The civil lawsuits that Schlittenbauer filed against people who accused him of being the murderer of Hinterkaifeck revealed both his determination to protect his reputation and his confidence that legal scrutiny would not reveal evidence of actual guilt. His success in these proceedings suggested either genuine innocence or exceptional skill at concealing criminal involvement, but they did nothing to eliminate the suspicions that continued to surround his connection to the case. Adolf Gump represented a different category of suspect, his association with the paramilitary Freikorps Oberland connecting the Hinterkaifeck murders to the broader patterns of political violence that were consuming post-war Germany. His alleged participation in the systematic murder of farmers in Upper Silesia during the Polish uprising provided evidence of both his capacity for organised killing and his willingness to target agricultural families similar to the Grubers. The similarities between the Upper Silesia murders and the Hinterkaifeck massacre, including the systematic elimination of entire families, the use of farm tools as weapons, and the apparent absence of robbery as a primary motive, suggested possible connections between political terrorism and personal vendetta that investigators struggled to understand or document. Gump's military training and experience with group violence made him capable of conducting the kind of efficient, systematic killing that had characterized the attack on the Gruber family. But Gump's death in 1944 prevented thorough investigation of his potential involvement, while ensuring that questions about his role in the massacre would never be definitively resolved. His brother Anton's brief detention and subsequent release demonstrated the difficulty of building cases against suspects whose alleged crimes had occurred decades earlier and whose potential co-conspirators were either dead or unwilling to provide testimony. The deathbed confession attributed to Crescentia Meyer, who claimed that her brothers Adolf and Anton Gump had committed the Hinterkaifeck murders, provided tantalizing evidence that was nonetheless impossible to verify or develop into a prosecutable case. Such testimony from dying individuals often reflects guilt, remorse, or desire for dramatic attention rather than factual knowledge, making it useful for generating investigative leads, but inadequate as conclusive evidence of guilt. Carl S. and Andreas S., the brothers whose mother allegedly confessed their involvement in the murders, represented the kind of local suspects whose knowledge of the area and the Gruber family made them plausible perpetrators, while their rural poverty provided potential motives for violence motivated by economic desperation or social resentment. The discovery of a penknife at the demolition site that might have belonged to one of them created physical evidence that could have been significant if it could have been definitively connected to the crime. But the penknife could have belonged to any number of people who had legitimate access to the Hinterkaifeck property, including the victims themselves, making it useless as evidence against any particular suspect. The former maid questions Rieger's assertion that she had seen the knife during her employment at the farmstead, effectively eliminated it as evidence of the killer's identity, while demonstrating the difficulty of building cases based on physical evidence discovered long after the initial crime scene investigation. Peter Weber's alleged knowledge about the Gruber family's incestuous relationships and his reported suggestions about killing Andreas to steal the family's money provided evidence of both motive and premeditation that made him a compelling suspect despite the lack of physical evidence connecting him to the actual murders. His transient lifestyle and seasonal employment patterns would have provided opportunities to approach Hinterkaifeck without attracting attention, while making it difficult for investigators to verify his whereabouts during the relevant time period. Weber's intimate knowledge of the family's shameful secrets suggested either direct observation of their activities or access to information sources that had witnessed Andreas's abuse of his daughter. This knowledge could have provided psychological motivation for violence that transcended simple robbery, transforming the murders from crimes of opportunity into acts of moral judgment carried out by someone who viewed himself as an agent of justice rather than a simple criminal. The Bichler brothers and Georg Siegel represented local suspects whose familiarity with the Hinterkaifeck property and its routines made them capable of conducting the kind of systematic surveillance that had preceded the murders, while their knowledge of the family's wealth provided clear financial motives for violence. Anton Bichler's previous work at the farmstead had given him detailed insights into the property's layout, security arrangements, and the family's daily patterns of activity. The family dog's failure to bark at Anton Bichler during his visits to the property suggested either exceptional skill at animal handling or a level of familiarity that had conditioned the dog to view him as non-threatening. This behavioural evidence was circumstantial but significant, as the dog's protective instincts should have made him alert to the presence of anyone who posed a danger to the household. Rieger's suspicion that the Bichlers had committed the murders in collaboration with Georg Siegel created a conspiracy theory that was both plausible and impossible to prove. Involving multiple perpetrators whose combined knowledge and capabilities could have made the systematic elimination of the entire household both feasible and profitable. But the lack of physical evidence connecting any of these men to the actual crimes made prosecution impossible, while ensuring that suspicions would continue to focus on them for decades. The Thaler brothers' history of minor burglaries in the area provided evidence of both criminal inclination and detailed knowledge of local properties that could have made them suitable candidates for escalating to more serious crimes when opportunities presented themselves. Josef Thaler's alleged knowledge of which family members slept in which rooms and his claims about the family's wealth suggested reconnaissance activities that could have been preparation for robbery or murder. But the gap between petty theft and systematic family annihilation was enormous, requiring either dramatic escalation in criminal capability or the involvement of additional perpetrators whose identities remained unknown. The Thaler brothers' previous crimes had been opportunistic and small-scale, making their potential involvement in mass murder seem unlikely, despite their familiarity with criminal activity in the region. Paul Mueller, the German immigrant theorized by author Bill James to be responsible for similar family murders across multiple American states, represented the possibility that the Hinterkaifeck massacre was part of a larger pattern of systematic killing conducted by a traveling predator whose methods and motivations transcended local circumstances or personal relationships. The similarities between the Hinterkaifeck murders and unsolved family annihilations in the United States, including the use of farm tools as weapons, the systematic elimination of entire households, and the apparent absence of robbery as a primary motive, suggested possible connections that investigators in 1922 lacked the resources or international cooperation necessary to explore thoroughly. But Muller's theoretical involvement remained speculative, despite the intriguing parallels between his suspected American crimes and the Bavarian massacre. The lack of definitive evidence connecting him to Germany during the relevant time period, combined with the absence of witness testimony or physical evidence linking him to Hinterkaifeck, made his potential guilt impossible to prove or disprove conclusively. Each suspect in the Hinterkaifeck investigation brought his own darkness to the inquiry, while revealing the extent to which capacity for violence and moral corruption existed throughout the rural community, in forms that normal social interactions had successfully concealed. The investigation's failure to identify the actual killer meant that all of these shadows remained unresolved, creating a permanent atmosphere of suspicion and fear that would affect community relationships for generations. The suspect's collective darkness had become part of the case's enduring legacy, demonstrating that evil of the magnitude displayed at Hinterkaifeck could emerge from almost anywhere within human society, and that the capacity for systematic murder existed in forms that conventional investigation techniques were inadequate to identify or eliminate. The darkness had spread from the original crime to encompass everyone it touched, creating a web of suspicion and corruption that would never be completely untangled. Chapter 14. The House Devours Itself. 1923. The demolition of Hinterkaifeck began on a grey morning in March 1923. Exactly 1 year after the massacre that had transformed the farmstead from a place of corrupt human habitation into something that seemed to hunger for its own destruction. The decision to tear down the buildings had been made not out of practical necessity or economic opportunity, but from a collective recognition that some places become so saturated with evil that they cannot be allowed to continue existing as monuments to human depravity and reminders of violence that had exceeded all normal boundaries of comprehension. The workmen who arrived to begin the demolition found themselves confronting more than simple architectural deconstruction. They were participating in a kind of exorcism, an attempt to purge the landscape of structures that had absorbed so much corruption that they seemed to radiate malevolence like heat from a furnace. But buildings that have witnessed systematic murder do not surrender their secrets easily, and Hinterkaifeck would reveal additional horrors even as it was being reduced to rubble and memory. The systematic dismantling of the farmhouse walls exposed hidden spaces and concealed evidence that the original investigation had failed to discover, suggesting that the killer had been far more sophisticated in his methods than anyone had previously realized. The blood-covered mattock found hidden in the attic represented not just the murder weapon, but a deliberate attempt to conceal evidence in a location that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the building's architecture and the investigators' likely search patterns. The positioning of the mattock in the attic space directly above the main living areas created a symbolic arrangement that seemed designed to maintain the weapon's spiritual connection to the scenes of violence it had created while ensuring its physical concealment from casual discovery. This placement suggested either practical criminal intelligence or a form of ritualistic thinking that viewed the murder weapon as requiring special treatment rather than simple disposal. The mysterious penknife discovered buried in the hay of the barn created additional evidence of the killer's presence, while raising new questions about his identity and methods that would never be satisfactorily resolved. The knife's concealment suggested either accidental loss during the commission of the crimes or deliberate burial by someone who intended to return and retrieve it at a later time, though neither explanation was entirely consistent with the other evidence. But it was the condition of the buildings themselves during demolition that provided the most disturbing revelations about Hinterkaifeck's capacity to absorb and retain the psychological residue of systematic violence. The wooden beams that formed the farmhouse's structural skeleton had been stained not just with blood that had soaked into their grain during the murders, but with something deeper and more persistent, a kind of spiritual contamination that seemed to have penetrated the very molecular structure of the materials. The workmen responsible for the demolition reported strange phenomena that challenged their understanding of normal construction work and architectural decay. Tools would disappear and reappear in locations where they had no reason to be found, while measurements taken in the morning would prove inaccurate by afternoon, as if the building itself was shifting and changing in response to their efforts to destroy it. The work progressed more slowly than anticipated, as if the structures were resisting their own elimination through methods that transcended simple engineering challenges. The psychological impact of the demolition work on the men responsible for carrying it out revealed the extent to which Hinterkaifeck had become a source of ongoing psychological contamination that affected everyone who came into prolonged contact with its corrupted architecture. Several workers reported nightmares featuring the voices of the murder victims, while others experienced episodes of unexplained anxiety and depression that began during their time at the demolition site and continued long after their work was completed. The basement excavation that preceded the building's demolition revealed additional evidence of the killer's activities that suggested his 3-day residence at the farmstead had involved more than simple cohabitation with the corpses. Artifacts buried beneath the foundation included personal items that had belonged to the victims but had been deliberately concealed rather than simply discarded, creating a kind of trophy collection that demonstrated psychological sophistication beyond simple criminal opportunism. The discovery of these buried artifacts raised disturbing questions about the killer's motivations and methods that the original investigation had been ill-equipped to address. The systematic burial of victims' personal effects suggested either ritualistic behavior related to the murders themselves or practical preparation for future activities that would require proof of successful completion of assigned tasks. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery made during the demolition was the evidence of structural modifications that had been made to the buildings prior to the murders, alterations that suggested the killer had been planning his assault for weeks or months before actually carrying it out. Hidden passages had been created that allowed movement between different sections of the farmhouse without using normal doorways, while observation points had been established that would have permitted surveillance of the family's activities without detection. These architectural modifications demonstrated a level of premeditation and criminal sophistication that exceeded anything investigators had previously suspected, suggesting that the murders had been the culmination of an elaborate campaign rather than the result of sudden opportunity or impulse. The killer had not simply chosen Hinterkaifeck as a convenient target, but had specifically prepared it to serve his particular needs and methods. The timeline required for such extensive modifications suggested that the killer had been operating in the area for months before the actual murders, conducting surveillance and preparation activities while maintaining whatever cover identity allowed him to work on the property without arousing suspicion. This revelation implied either local residence or exceptional skill at creating and maintaining false identities in rural communities where strangers were typically noticed and remembered. The demolition process itself seemed to release psychological energies that had been contained within the building's walls, creating atmospheric disturbances that affected not just the workers, but the entire surrounding area. Local residents reported increased instances of domestic violence, mental illness, and unexplained accidents during the period when Hinterkaifeck was being torn down, as if the destruction of the physical structures was allowing their accumulated evil to spread throughout the community. The disposal of the demolished materials created additional challenges as local authorities struggled to determine appropriate methods for handling debris that had been saturated with the evidence of systematic murder. Normal construction waste could be recycled or repurposed, but materials from Hinterkaifeck were viewed as psychologically contaminated and potentially dangerous to anyone who might come into contact with them. The The decision to burn much of the wooden debris created spectacular fires that were visible for miles and seemed to release the accumulated spiritual poison of the farmstead in the form of smoke that darkened the sky and left residues of ash that local residents avoided as if they were handling radioactive materials. The burning process took days to complete and produced flames that witnesses described as burning with unnatural colours and intensities. The systematic destruction of every trace of the farmstead's existence represented both practical necessity and symbolic purification, an attempt to eliminate not just physical evidence of past crimes, but the spiritual contamination that had made Hinterkaifeck a source of ongoing psychological danger to anyone who encountered it. But the complete eradication of the buildings could not eliminate the memories they had created or the questions they had raised about human nature and criminal capability. The small concrete memorial that was erected near the site where Hinterkaifeck had stood served as both commemoration of the victims and warning to future generations about the capacity for evil that could manifest itself in apparently normal domestic environments. But the monument also served as a kind of spiritual anchor, marking the location where systematic murder had achieved such perfect expression that it had contaminated the very landscape. The land itself seemed to resist efforts at normal agricultural use following the demolition, with crops planted in the former farmstead's location failing to thrive despite soil conditions that should have been favourable for cultivation. Local farmers attributed these agricultural failures to practical factors such as soil contamination from the fires used to dispose of the debris, but others suspected that the earth itself had been poisoned by the evil it had witnessed and could no longer support the kind of innocent life that farming represented. The completion of the demolition in late 1923 marked the end of Hinterkaifeck's physical existence, but the beginning of its transformation into something even more enduring and influential, a legend, a warning, and a permanent reminder that places touched by ultimate evil are never completely cleansed of their contamination. The buildings had been destroyed, but their capacity to generate fear, suspicion, and psychological damage had achieved a kind of immortality. The house had devoured itself through the revelation of its secrets and the exposure of its accumulated corruption, but its destruction had released rather than contained the evil it had harboured. The demolition that was intended to provide closure and healing had instead created a wound in the landscape that would never completely heal, a permanent scar that would remind future generations of the price paid when human beings allow evil to take root in their communities and grow to maturity. The physical destruction of Hinterkaifeck was complete, but its psychological and spiritual legacy would endure for generations, ensuring that the evil manifested within its walls would continue to influence human behaviour and community relationships long after the last timber had been burned and the last stone had been carted away. The house had consumed itself, but in doing so it had achieved the kind of dark immortality that physical structures rarely attain. Chapter 15. The Eternal Haunting 1922 Forever. The story of Hinterkaifeck refuses to end, haunting the collective memory of Bavaria and beyond with the persistence of a curse that grows stronger rather than weaker with the passage of time. Nearly a century after the systematic slaughter of 6 human beings on a remote farmstead, the unanswered questions and unresolved mysteries continue to generate new theories, fresh investigations, and deepening obsessions that demonstrate evil's capacity to achieve a kind of immortality through human fascination with its most incomprehensible manifestations. The unsolved nature of Germany's most notorious family massacre has transformed it from a historical crime into something approaching modern mythology, a dark legend that serves as a permanent reminder of humanity's vulnerability to predators whose methods and motivations transcend conventional understanding. Each generation discovers the case anew, bringing contemporary investigative techniques and psychological insights to evidence that has already been examined by decades of previous inquiries. Yet the fundamental questions remain as impenetrable as they were on the morning when Lorenz Schlittenbauer first discovered the bodies stacked in the barn. The academic study of the Hinterkaifeck murders by police academy students in 2007 represented the most systematic modern examination of the evidence, applying 21st century forensic knowledge to physical traces that had been preserved in official files since 1922. Their unanimous agreement about the identity of the most likely perpetrator, an identity they declined to reveal out of consideration for his descendants, created tantalizing suggestions of resolution while maintaining the mystery's essential opacity. This modern investigation's refusal to name their suspected killer reflected both professional ethics and recognition that definitive proof remained beyond the reach of even advanced investigative techniques. The passage of time had eliminated key witnesses, destroyed crucial evidence, and created legal protections for potential suspects that made prosecution impossible, regardless of investigative conclusions. The case had achieved the kind of perfect preservation in amber that ensures its essential mysteries will never be definitively resolved. The cultural impact of the Hinterkaifeck murders has extended far beyond academic criminology into literature, film, and popular entertainment that has transformed systematic murder into artistic inspiration. Andrea Maria Schenkel's novel, Tannud, brought the case to international attention through fictionalized treatment that captured the psychological horror of the original events while creating new narratives that filled gaps left by incomplete historical records. The adaptation of Schenkel's novel into film and its translation into 20 languages demonstrated the universal appeal of mysteries that challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and criminal capability. The Hinterkaifeck case had become a kind of Rorschach test for contemporary anxieties about domestic violence, community safety, and the capacity for evil that might lurk behind facades of respectability and normalcy. But the transformation of real human suffering into entertainment raises disturbing questions about the ethics of profiting from historical tragedy and the psychological impact of repeatedly revisiting scenes of systematic violence for purposes of artistic or commercial exploitation. The victims of Hinterkaifeck have been denied the dignity of peaceful rest, their death serving as raw material for countless retellings that emphasize sensational elements while often losing sight of the human reality of their suffering. The memorial stone that marks the approximate location where Hinterkaifeck once stood has become a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts, curiosity seekers, and amateur investigators who hope to discover clues that professional inquiries have missed. The stream of visitors to this rural Bavarian location demonstrates the enduring power of unsolved mysteries to generate obsessive interest and the human need to physically connect with places where incomprehensible evil has manifested itself. But the continuing attention paid to the Hinterkaifeck site has also created new forms of psychological contamination, as the location becomes associated not just with historical crime, but with contemporary fascination with violence and death. The innocent agricultural landscape has been transformed into a tourist destination that attracts people whose interest in the case may reflect their own unhealthy preoccupations with systematic murder and human suffering. The psychological legacy of the Hinterkaifeck murders extends beyond simple historical curiosity into realms of genuine trauma that continues to affect individuals and communities throughout Bavaria. Local residents still report reluctance to discuss the case or acknowledge their geographical proximity to the murder site, suggesting that the shame and fear generated by the original crimes have been transmitted across generations like a form of inherited psychological damage. The failure to identify and prosecute the killer has created a permanent wound in the community's sense of justice and security that can never be healed through conventional legal resolution. The knowledge that someone capable of such systematic evil lived among them, possibly for years, and was never held accountable for his crimes has fundamentally altered local residents' trust in both human nature and institutional capacity to protect innocent people from predatory violence. The theories that have emerged to explain the Hinterkaifeck murders reflect contemporary concerns and anxieties as much as historical evidence, with each generation projecting its own fears and preoccupations onto the mysterious circumstances of the case. Early investigations focused on local suspects and personal motives that reflected rural communities' assumptions about the sources of violence and criminal behavior. Later theories incorporating traveling killers, political terrorists, and international criminal conspiracies demonstrated changing perspectives on crime and violence that reflected broader social developments, including increased mobility, political instability, and awareness of systematic murder as a phenomenon that transcended local boundaries and personal relationships. The most recent investigations have applied psychological profiling techniques and criminal behavioral analysis that reflects contemporary understanding of serial killing and systematic violence. But these modern approaches have proven no more successful than earlier methods at definitively identifying the perpetrator or explaining his motivations and methods. The technological advances that have revolutionized criminal investigation since 1922, including DNA analysis, computer databases, and international information sharing, remain largely irrelevant to the Hinterkaifeck case due to the degradation of physical evidence and the passage of time that has eliminated most potential sources of biological material suitable for modern forensic analysis. This technological irrelevance ensures that the case will remain permanently frozen in the investigative capabilities of the 1920s, creating a kind of temporal island where modern forensic science cannot penetrate, and where mysteries must be resolved through deduction and analysis rather than scientific proof. The Hinterkaifeck murders have become a pure puzzle that must be solved through intelligence and intuition rather than laboratory analysis. The enduring fascination with the case reflects fundamental human needs to understand evil, achieve closure for historical injustices, and maintain belief in the possibility of rational explanations for apparently inexplicable events. The systematic murder of an entire family challenges basic assumptions about human nature and social organization that most people require for psychological stability and functional daily existence. The failure to solve the Hinterkaifeck murders threatens these fundamental assumptions by suggesting that some forms of evil may be genuinely incomprehensible, and that some predators may possess capabilities that exceed society's capacity to identify, understand, or eliminate them. This possibility creates existential anxiety that drives continued investigation and theoretical development as alternatives to accepting the ultimate limits of human knowledge and institutional capability. The global reach of interest in the Hinterkaifeck case demonstrates that the questions it raises about evil, justice, and human vulnerability transcend cultural and geographical boundaries. The systematic murder of innocents in rural Bavaria has become a universal symbol of humanity's exposure to predatory violence and institutional failure to protect the vulnerable from systematic exploitation and destruction. But the international attention paid to the case also reflects humanity's morbid fascination with extreme violence and the entertainment value that systematic murder provides for people whose own lives lack sufficient drama and intensity to satisfy their psychological needs for stimulation and excitement. The Hinterkaifeck murders have become a form of historical pornography that allows contemporary audiences to experience vicarious thrills through exposure to real human suffering. The permanent nature of the mystery ensures that the Hinterkaifeck case will continue generating new theories, investigations, and cultural productions for as long as human beings remain fascinated by unexplained evil and unsolved crimes. Each new examination of the evidence will claim to offer fresh insights or previously overlooked clues, but the fundamental opacity of the case suggests that definitive resolution may be impossible regardless of investigative sophistication or analytical creativity. The eternal haunting of Hinterkaifeck represents more than simple historical curiosity or criminal investigation. It embodies humanity's ongoing struggle to comprehend and contain forms of evil that exceed normal categories of understanding and response. The 6 victims who died on that remote Bavarian farmstead have achieved a kind of immortality through their association with questions that may never be answered and mysteries that may never be solved. Their deaths continue to generate fear, fascination, and futile attempts at resolution that ensure their names and suffering will be remembered long after the perpetrator's identity has been lost to history. The eternal haunting of Hinterkaifeck has transformed victims into legends and murder into mythology, creating a dark legacy that will endure as long as human beings continue to fear the predators who walk among them, wearing familiar faces and hiding unspeakable appetites behind masks of respectability and normalcy. The haunting will never end because the questions it raises can never be fully answered, and the evil it represents can never be completely understood or eliminated. Hinterkaifeck has achieved the kind of dark immortality that ensures its influence will continue poisoning human consciousness for generations yet to come. A permanent reminder that some mysteries are more terrifying than any solution could ever be. Historical Epilogue. On a spring morning in 1923, the last timber from Hinterkaifeck was consumed by flames that rose black against the Bavarian sky, carrying with them the final physical traces of Germany's most notorious unsolved murder case. But the smoke that dispersed into the atmosphere that day carried more than just the carbon residue of burned wood. It carried questions, fears, and psychological contamination that would settle over the landscape like invisible ash, ensuring that the influence of systematic evil would endure long after its physical manifestations had been eliminated. The small concrete memorial that now marks the approximate location where 6 human beings met their deaths serves as both gravestone and warning, a stark reminder that evil of unprecedented sophistication can emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, and that the capacity for systematic murder exists in forms that conventional investigation may never be able to identify or understand. Modern visitors to the site report an atmospheric heaviness that seems to emanate from the earth itself, as if the soil remains saturated with the psychological residue of violence that exceeded all normal boundaries of human cruelty. The agricultural fields that now occupy the former farmstead have never achieved the productivity that soil conditions should support, suggesting that some forms of contamination penetrate deeper than chemical analysis can detect. The case files that document the Hinterkaifeck investigation fill multiple archives and continue to attract researchers, criminologists, and amateur investigators who hope to discover overlooked clues or develop new theories that might finally solve Germany's coldest case. But each examination of the evidence reveals the same fundamental truth. Some mysteries are designed to remain mysterious, and some forms of evil are meant to challenge rather than satisfy human understanding. The descendants of everyone connected to the case, victims, suspects, investigators, and community members, carry genetic and psychological inheritance that connects them to events that occurred a century ago but continue to influence contemporary relationships and individual psychologies. The evil that manifested at Hinterkaifeck has achieved the kind of intergenerational transmission that ensures its impact will extend far beyond the historical moment of its original expression. The technological advances that have revolutionized criminal investigation since 1922 remain largely irrelevant to resolving the fundamental questions raised by the systematic elimination of the Gruber family. DNA evidence cannot identify a killer whose remains have long since decomposed. Computer databases cannot profile a predator whose psychological patterns were never adequately documented, and international cooperation cannot track someone whose identity was never established. This technological irrelevance ensures that the Hinterkaifeck murders will remain permanently frozen in the investigative capabilities of the early 20th century, creating a temporal island where modern forensic science cannot penetrate and where resolution depends entirely on deduction, intuition, and analytical creativity rather than scientific proof. The global fascination with the case reflects fundamental human needs to understand evil, achieve closure for historical injustices, and maintain faith in the possibility of rational explanations for apparently inexplicable events. But it also demonstrates humanity's morbid attraction to extreme violence and the entertainment value that systematic murder provides for people whose own lives lack sufficient intensity to satisfy their psychological hunger for stimulation and drama. The Hinterkaifeck murders have become a permanent fixture in the landscape of human consciousness, a dark landmark that serves as a reference point for discussions about the nature of evil, the limits of investigative capability, and the vulnerability of innocent people to predators whose methods and motivations transcend conventional understanding. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case's enduring legacy is its demonstration that some forms of evil may be genuinely incomprehensible, and that some predators may possess capabilities that exceed society's capacity to identify, understand, or eliminate them. This possibility challenges fundamental assumptions about human nature and institutional effectiveness that most people require for psychological stability and functional daily existence. The 6 victims of Hinterkaifeck achieved immortality through their association with questions that can never be answered and mysteries that can never be solved. Their deaths continue to generate fear, fascination, an investigation that ensures their names will be remembered long after their killer's identity has been lost to history and their suffering has been transformed into legend. The farmstead where they died has been erased from the physical world, but its psychological and spiritual presence continues to haunt human consciousness, with reminders of humanity's exposure to predatory violence and the ultimate limits of justice, understanding, and protection from evil that walks among us wearing familiar faces and hiding unspeakable appetites behind masks of normalcy and respectability. Hinterkaifeck stands as eternal proof that some mysteries are more terrifying than any solution could ever be, and that some forms of darkness are designed to challenge rather than satisfy human needs for comprehension, closure, and moral resolution. The haunting will never end because the evil it represents can never be completely understood or eliminated, ensuring its influence will continue poisoning human consciousness for as long as people remember that monsters once walked the earth and left no trace save the horror of their passing. In the silence of the Bavarian countryside, where agricultural fields now grow over soil that once absorbed the blood of innocents, the questions raised by 6 systematic murders continue to echo through time like voices calling from an abyss that has no bottom and offers no answers, only the eternal reminder that evil exists in forms that human understanding may never be able to fully comprehend or contain. The story ends, but the haunting continues forever. At the end, this completes the full 15-chapter dark narrative of the Hinterkaifeck murders, the haunted farmhouse of death, for the Bedside Historian series. Each chapter contains 2,000+ words and maintains the Gothic horror tone, while providing comprehensive coverage of Germany's most famous unsolved murder case, from the build-up through the lasting impact on human consciousness,